It's a unique site because it's much older than all the other ones. It's belonging to the 10th and 9th millennium BC. So it means, roughly spoken, the monuments there are 12,000 years old, 12,000 years before today.
From the razor-sharp precision of Pumapunku's H-blocks to the impossible mechanical complexity of the Antikythera Mechanism, the archaeological record is riddled with anomalies that shatter our conventional timeline of human progress. How did the builders of Göbekli Tepe construct a sophisticated temple complex before the invention of agriculture? And what lost secret allowed the Romans to create concrete that heals itself while ours crumbles? Join us as we travel from the submerged ruins of Yonaguni to the acoustic mysteries of the Andes, examining the undeniable evidence of advanced engineering, lost metallurgy, and prehistoric power that challenges everything we thought we knew about the capabilities of our ancestors. Before we begin, let us know in the comments below where in the world you're watching from and what time it is there. Now settle in for a relaxing journey to the ancient discoveries the world still can't explain. Six miles from the ancient city of Urfa in southeastern Turkey stands a ridge that locals had long ignored. For generations, farmers ploughed around the limestone protruding from the earth, dismissing the fragmented slabs as nothing more than nuisance rocks or the remnants of a medieval cemetery. It was not until the mid-90s that a German archaeologist named Klaus Schmidt climbed the slope of Göbekli Tepe and recognized that the flint chips littering the ground were not natural formations but the debris of a massive prehistoric workshop. What lay beneath that soil would eventually force historians to rewrite the timeline of human civilization. Schmidt had stumbled upon a site that predated Stonehenge by 6,000 years and the Great Pyramids by 7,000, a complex constructed at the very end of the last ice age when humanity was supposedly composed of nothing more than scattered bands of hunter-gatherers living hand to mouth. The unearthed enclosures revealed circles of massive T-shaped pillars, some standing 18 feet tall and weighing up to 16 tons, arranged with a deliberate geometric precision that implies a level of social organization previously thought impossible for the era. The true mystery of Göbekli Tepe lies not just in the size of the stones, but in the artistry carved into them. Without the use of metal tools, these ancient masons etched three-dimensional reliefs of scorpions, lions, vultures, and foxes into the hard limestone. These are not crude scratches, but sophisticated artistic expressions, where the creature seems to emerge from the stone itself. The biological accuracy suggests a people who were intimately familiar with the fauna of their world, yet the symbolism hints at a complex theology or cosmology that we can only guess at. The pillars themselves are often interpreted as stylized human figures, with carved arms resting on bellies and belts adorned with loincloths standing in eternal council. The labour required to quarry, transport and erect these monoliths without wheels or beasts of burden would have required hundreds of people working in concert, fed and supported by a logistical network that conventional history says should not have existed until the invention of agriculture. This discovery upended the standard model of the Neolithic Revolution. For decades, the academic consensus held that agriculture came first, allowing populations to settle, which then led to the development of religion and monumental architecture. Göbekli Tepe suggests the reverse is true. The urge to worship, to gather, and to build something permanent may have been the catalyst that forced these wandering groups to invent farming to feed the workforce required for such a sacred undertaking. The site was not a settlement but a cathedral on a hill, a destination for pilgrimage. Even more baffling is the site's ultimate fate. After thousands of years of use, the enclosures were not destroyed by war or abandoned to the elements. They were deliberately buried. The builders hauled thousands of tons of earth and refused to cover their creation, sealing it like a time capsule. This intentional act of closure preserved the pillars in pristine condition, leaving us to wonder why a culture would expend such immense effort to hide their greatest achievement from the world. While the visual grandeur of these sites captures the imagination, a growing field of archaeoacoustics is investigating whether the architects of the ancient world were engineering sound as much as stone. In the grand chambers of the Halsaflieni Hypogeum in Malta, an underground sanctuary carved 3 levels deep into solid limestone, the auditory properties create a physical sensation that defies explanation. The complex, dating back to 3000 BC, features a niche known as the Oracle Chamber. When a male voice chants at a frequency of 110 Hz within this space, the sound does not merely echo, but resonates in a way that creates a standing wave, enveloping the listener and seemingly altering their state of consciousness. Modern neurological studies on volunteers exposed to this specific frequency in the chamber have shown a shift in brain activity from the left hemisphere to the right, inducing a trance-like state and stimulating the emotional center of the brain. It appears the builders possessed an empirical understanding of how sound interacts with the human mind and the geometry of the rock, crafting a temple that was effectively a machine for spiritual transcendence. This acoustic mastery is echoed across the Atlantic in the Chavin de Huantar complex in the Peruvian Andes. Here, beneath the massive stone structures, lies a labyrinth of narrow tunnels and galleries designed to manipulate air and water. The Lanzon Gallery, which houses the terrifying supreme deity of the Chavin culture, is connected to a series of canals that channel the rushing water of the Mosna River. The hydraulic engineering was designed to create a thunderous roar that would vibrate through the temple floor, simulating the voice of the jaguar god. Visitors, likely under the influence of the hallucinogenic San Pedro cactus, would have been subjected to a sensory overload where the earth shook and the walls roared. The architecture was not passive, it was an active participant in the ritual, a piece of psychological technology designed to solidify the power of the priesthood through sheer sensory dominance. The precision required to tune these stone structures suggests a transmission of knowledge that is absent from the written record. At the Maya site of Chichen Itza, the pyramid of Kukulkan demonstrates an acoustic phenomenon that attracts tourists to this day. A hand clap at the base of the staircase reflects back as a distinct chirping sound, mimicking the call of the quetzal, a bird sacred to the Maya. This is not a random echo. The geometry of the limestone steps is calculated to scatter the sound waves in a specific pattern that alters the frequency. To achieve this effect by accident is statistically improbable. To achieve it by design implies a grasp of wave mechanics and architectural acoustics that rivals modern theatre design. We are left looking at these silent ruins and realizing they were never meant to be silent. They were built to sing, to roar, and to speak in the voices of the gods, utilizing the physics of sound to bridge the gap between the earthly and the divine. High in the Andes Mountains, overlooking the city of Cusco, the fortress of Sacsayhuaman presents a challenge to our understanding of physical mechanics. The site is constructed of massive limestone blocks, some weighing upwards of 120 tons, cut into irregular polygonal shapes that fit together with such extreme precision that not even a sheet of paper can slide between them. There is no mortar holding these stones in place. They are locked together by gravity and the sheer perfection of their interlocking joints. The conventional explanation is that the Inca achieved this by pounding the stones with harder river rocks and sanding them into place. However, the scale of the labour and the three-dimensional complexity of the cuts make this theory difficult to accept for engineers who study the site. The blocks are not merely flat-faced bricks. They possess compound curves and corners that interlock in 3 dimensions, creating a structure that is virtually earthquake-proof. When the ground shakes in this seismically active region, the stones dance. They move slightly to dissipate the energy of the tremor and then settle back into their original positions. Colonial Spanish buildings in Cusco, constructed with rigid mortar and European techniques, have crumbled repeatedly over the centuries, while the Inca foundations beneath them remain untouched. The quarry from which these stones were taken lies several miles away, across steep ravines and rugged terrain. To transport a single 100-ton block across such a landscape is a logistical nightmare. To transport thousands of them and then lift them into place with such accuracy that they form a seamless jigsaw puzzle wall is a feat that modern cranes and hydraulic lifts would struggle to replicate with the same elegance. Some of the stones at Sacsayhuaman and the nearby site of Ollantaytambo show signs of vitrification, a process where the stone has been subjected to intense heat, causing the surface to melt and become glass-like. This anomaly has led to wild speculation, but geologists and chemists analysing the samples are faced with a contradiction. The heat required to vitrify limestone is immense, far beyond what could be achieved by simple wood fires. Furthermore, the vitrification is often found on the joints or the surfaces of the stones, leading some researchers to hypothesize that the ancients possessed a method of chemically softening the stone or using localized heat to mold the rock like clay. While this sounds like science fiction, the physical evidence of the molded surfaces and the inexplicable fit of the joinery demands an explanation that goes beyond copper chisels and stone hammers. We are seeing the remnants of a technology of stoneworking that was fundamentally different from our own, a method that viewed rock not as a rigid solid to be chipped away, but as a malleable material to be shaped. Buried beneath the shifting sands of Saqqara in Egypt lies a subterranean complex that defies the narrative of gradual technological progression. The Serapeum is a labyrinth of tunnels hewn from the living bedrock, housing over 20 massive granite sarcophagi. These are not standard coffins. Each box, including its lid, weighs roughly 100 tons. They are cut from single blocks of rose granite and basalt, materials that are notoriously difficult to work with due to their extreme hardness. The boxes were transported from quarries in Aswan, over 500 miles away, and then lowered into these cramped underground chambers with a margin of error so small that there is barely room to stand between the sarcophagus and the tunnel wall. The true shock comes when one applies modern metrology to these containers. The internal surfaces of the boxes are flat to within a few 10,000ths of an inch. The corners are perfect 90-degree angles verified by precision engineering squares. This level of accuracy is unnecessary for a burial container. A rough-hewn box would suffice to hold a mummified Apis bull, which is the traditional explanation for the site's purpose. Yet, the builders chose to achieve a level of manufacturing precision that mirrors the standards of the modern aerospace industry. To achieve such flatness and angularity in granite requires high-speed rotation, fixed-axis grinding, and diamond-tipped abrasives in our modern world. The dynastic Egyptians possessed copper saws and sand. The discrepancy between the tools found in the archaeological record and the finished product in the Serapeum is a chasm that has yet to be bridged. Furthermore, the sheer logistics of moving these boxes into place remains an unsolved engineering problem. The tunnels are too narrow for large teams of men to pull ropes. The corners are too sharp for long levers. The boxes sit in recesses that are lower than the floor level of the hallway, meaning they had to be lowered with absolute control. If a 100-ton granite box slips even an inch, it would crush anything in its path and likely wedge itself inextricably in the narrow chamber. Yet there are no chip marks on the walls, no signs of struggle. They sit perfectly centered. The lids, weighing 30 tons alone, fit with such precision that when closed, the air inside would be forced out, creating a hermetic seal. Why would a civilization go to such lengths to create airtight, optically perfect granite boxes for the burial of bulls? And where are the bulls? When the Serapeum was first opened by Auguste Mariette in 1850, most of the boxes were empty. The few that contained organic matter were pulverized remnants, not the carefully preserved mummies found elsewhere. The void inside these boxes echoes the void in our understanding. In 1929, a group of historians working in the Topkapi Palace in Istanbul discovered a fragment of a map drawn on gazelle skin. It was compiled in 1513 by the Ottoman admiral and cartographer Piri Reis. At first glance, it appeared to be a standard Portolan chart of the era, a navigational tool used by sailors to traverse the Atlantic. However, as cartographers began to analyse the coastlines depicted, they realised they were looking at something impossible. The map details the western coast of Africa and the eastern coast of South America with reasonable accuracy for the 16th century, but as the eye travels south, the map depicts a landmass that corresponds to the northern coast of Antarctica. This is problematic for two massive reasons. First, Antarctica was not officially discovered until 1820, more than 300 years after Piri Reis drew his map. Second, and more disturbing, the coastline depicted is not the ice shelf we see today, but the landmass beneath the ice. The Piri Reis map shows rivers, mountain ranges and bays in Queen Maud Land that are currently buried under a mile of glacial ice. Seismic soundings and ground-penetrating radar surveys conducted in the mid-20th century confirm the topography of the subglacial bedrock, matching the details on the map. The last time this coastline was free of ice and visible to the human eye was approximately 4000 BC. Piri Reis himself noted in the margins that his work was a compilation derived from 20 older source maps, some dating back to the time of Alexander the Great, and others he referred to as mathematical maps. This implies a lineage of cartographic knowledge stretching back into deep antiquity, passed down and copied by successive civilizations, who may not have even understood what they were copying. The mathematical projection used in the map introduces another layer of complexity. The distortion of the continent suggests an equidistant projection centered on Cairo, a technique that requires an understanding of spherical trigonometry and the ability to calculate longitude with precision. The chronometer, necessary for accurate longitude calculation, was not invented until the 18th century. The Piri Reis map suggests that someone in the distant past had the capability to survey the globe, calculate longitude, and map the Antarctic coastline before the Ice Age claimed it. It points to a lost epoch of maritime exploration, a time when the world was known and charted by a civilization whose ships and instruments have long since rotted away, leaving only lines of ink on fragile skin to testify to their existence. In the spring of 1900, a group of Greek sponge divers sought shelter from a storm off the coast of the island of Antikythera. When the waters calmed, they dove to check for sponges and instead found the wreckage of a Roman galley that had sunk around 60 BC. Among the marble statues and bronze amphorae hauled to the surface was a shapeless, corroded lump of bronze and wood, barely the size of a shoebox. It sat in the National Archaeological Museum in Athens for years, ignored and drying out until it cracked open to reveal a series of precision-cut bronze gears. This was the Antikythera Mechanism, an artifact that has been called the first analog computer in history. For decades, the complexity of the device was underestimated. It wasn't until the turn of the 21st century that advanced X-ray tomography and high-resolution surface imaging allowed researchers to peer inside the corroded mass and reconstruct its internal workings. The results were staggering. The mechanism contained at least 30 interlocking bronze gears, some with teeth no larger than a millimetre, calibrated to track the astronomical cycles of the Sun, the Moon, and the 5 known planets. It could predict eclipses decades in advance, track the 4-year cycle of the Olympic Games, and even account for the variable speed of the Moon's orbit caused by its elliptical path around the Earth. To achieve this lunar correction, the device utilised a pin-and-slot mechanism that mimics a differential gear, an engineering concept that was not patented in the modern world until the 19th century. The existence of the Antikythera mechanism challenges the linear view of technological progress. We tend to view the ancient world as a steady climb from primitive tools to complex machines, but this device appears as a singular spike of genius on the graph of history. If this technology existed in 60 BC, where are the others? A device of this sophistication cannot be a prototype. It requires a tradition of manufacturing, a lineage of master mechanics, and a theoretical understanding of astronomy and mathematics that was thought to have been lost until the Renaissance. The fact that it was found in a shipwreck suggests it was a luxury item being transported, perhaps one of many. Its discovery forces us to ask what else was lost when the Library of Alexandria burned, and how many other gears lie corroded on the ocean floor, waiting to tell us that the ancient world was far more mechanical, precise, and advanced than we ever dared to imagine. Scattered across the rugged highlands of Scotland are the ruins of Iron Age hill forts that present a thermal mystery. These structures, known as vitrified forts, consist of stone walls where the rocks have been fused together by intense heat. This is not the result of accidental fires during a siege. The heat required to melt the basalt and sandstone blocks into a solid glassy mass exceeds 1,000 degrees Celsius and must be sustained for days. Sites like Dundeerdale and Tapo North show massive ramparts where the vitrification is uniform and structural, suggesting it was a deliberate construction technique rather than the result of destruction. Experimental archaeologists have attempted to replicate this effect by building replica walls and setting them ablaze with massive amounts of timber. While they have achieved some melting, they have struggled to replicate the thorough, deep fusion seen in the ancient walls. The sheer volume of fuel required to maintain such temperatures on a windy Scottish hilltop is staggering. It would require deforestation on an industrial scale. The question remains why. Vitrification actually weakens the stone, making it brittle and prone to shattering under impact. It does not make the wall stronger against battering rams. If it was an act of war, a way to destroy an enemy's fort, the fuel logistics make it an impractical tactic. If it was a construction technique, it was a flawed one. Some theories venture into the ritualistic, suggesting that the forts were destroyed as a form of closure or sacrifice, similar to the bearing of Göbekli Tepe. Others suggest we are missing a key piece of chemical knowledge, a flux or accelerant that the ancients used to lower the melting point of the stone, allowing them to weld rock with manageable fires. The vitrified forts stand as a testament to a lost pyrotechnology, a method of manipulating matter that we can observe but cannot fully reproduce. They are scars on the landscape, evidence of a time when fire was used not just for warmth or war, but as a tool to fundamentally alter the geology of the world. In the parched desert of the Paracas Peninsula in Peru, archaeologists have uncovered hundreds of skulls that challenge our understanding of human biology and cultural modification. These are the Paracas skulls, famous for their extreme cranial elongation. While cranial deformation, the practice of binding an infant's head to change its shape, is a known practice in various ancient cultures, the Paracas skulls exhibit anomalies that go beyond mere reshaping. Standard cranial deformation changes the shape of the skull but not its volume. You can squash a balloon, but you cannot increase the amount of air inside it. However, some of the Paracas skulls have a cranial capacity that is significantly larger and up to 60% heavier than the average human skull. The anatomical differences continue. The human skull is composed of two parietal plates separated by a sagittal suture. Many of the Paracas skulls lack this suture entirely, presenting a single solid bone plate across the top of the skull. The eye sockets are larger and more robust, and the position of the foramen magnum, the hole at the base of the skull where the spine connects, is located further back than in normal humans. These physiological differences are difficult to explain solely through the binding of heads. Binding does not fuse sutures or increase bone mass, it merely directs growth. DNA testing on samples from these skulls has produced controversial and often contested results, with some initial reports suggesting genetic haplogroups that are not native to South America, pointing instead to origins in the Black Sea and Caucasus region. This implies a migration of people across the ocean thousands of years before Columbus, a theory that aligns with the anomalies of the Peary race map and the shared architectural styles of the ancient world. The Paracas people were a genetically distinct elite, ruling over the local population, burying their dead in elaborate baskets, and possessing physical traits that set them apart from the rest of humanity. Whether these traits were the result of extreme genetic isolation, a lost subspecies of human, or a cultural practice we simply do not understand, the skulls remain a biological puzzle staring back at us from the dusty shelves of museums. In the Great Lakes region of North America, specifically on Isle Royale and the Keweenaw Peninsula, there exists evidence of a massive industrial operation that occurred thousands of years ago. We find thousands of prehistoric copper pits, mines dug deep into the earth to extract the purest copper in the world. Estimates suggest that between 2500 BC and 1200 BC, upwards of 500 million pounds of copper were extracted from this region. The scale of the mining is colossal. The ancient miners used stone hammers and thermal shock, heating the rock with fire and cracking it with cold water, to extract the metal. The mystery lies in the missing copper. While copper artifacts from this period are found in burial mounds across North America, the quantity discovered accounts for only a tiny fraction of the metal that was mined. Where did the rest of it go? 500 million pounds of copper is enough to equip a massive Bronze Age army, yet the indigenous peoples of the region were largely hunter-gatherers who used copper for small tools and ornaments, not for mass production of weaponry or armour. This discrepancy has led to the diffusionist theory that the Michigan copper was being shipped overseas to fuel the Bronze Age civilizations of Europe and the Mediterranean. The timing of the mining operations coincides perfectly with the height of the Bronze Age in the Old World. Is it possible that a transatlantic trade network existed, driven by the hunger for metal? We know that the Bronze Age empires were desperate for tin and copper. If the local sources were depleted or insufficient, would they have sailed to the ends of the earth to find more? The absence of the copper in the Americas and the sudden influx of bronze in Europe creates a circumstantial link that is hard to ignore, suggesting that the ancient world was a global economy long before the Silk Road was ever travelled. To support such a radical hypothesis, researchers point to the chemical composition of the copper itself. Michigan copper is unique in its purity, often found in a nearly 100% metallic state known as native copper, which requires no smelting to separate the metal from the ore. This specific geological fingerprint differs significantly from the copper ores found in Europe and the Middle East, which typically contain high levels of impurities like arsenic or lead and require complex processing. When scientists analyze the copper ingots recovered from Bronze Age shipwrecks in the Mediterranean, such as the famous Uluburan shipwreck dating to the late 14th century BC, they find metal of exceptional purity. While mainstream archaeology attributes this to sophisticated refining techniques, Proponents of the transatlantic theory argue that the chemical signature aligns more closely with the native copper of the Great Lakes. The absence of large slag heaps in Michigan, the waste product of smelting, further supports the idea that the copper was extracted in its raw, pure form and transported elsewhere for casting. If the indigenous populations were not smelting the copper and there are no massive slag piles, the raw material must have left the continent. The logistical undertaking of such an enterprise is almost difficult to conceptualize without conceding that ancient maritime capabilities were vastly underestimated. To move 500 million pounds of copper from the interior of North America to the coast requires a transportation network that rivals the trade routes of the Roman Empire. The route would have likely involved navigating the Great Lakes, traversing the St. Lawrence River, and then braving the open Atlantic. This implies the existence of large ocean-going vessels and a class of navigators who understood the currents and star charts necessary for deep-water travel. Indigenous oral traditions in the region speak of marine men who came from afar to take the white metal, describing them as sailing in large boats with wings. These legends, often dismissed as myth, may preserve the historical memory of these ancient mariners. The convergence of the geological data, the inexplicable mining scale, and the oral histories creates a compelling case that the Atlantic was not a barrier, but a bridge crossed by cultures hungry for the resources necessary to build the weapons and monuments of the Old World. In the dusty shelves of the Topkapi Palace Library in Istanbul, a discovery was made in 1929 that would challenge the timeline of human exploration and cartography. A gazelle skin parchment, compiled in 1513 by the Ottoman admiral and cartographer Ahmed Muhyiddin Piri, better known as Piri Reis, depicted the world with a level of precision that should have been impossible for the 16th century. The map, which Piri Reis claimed was a compilation of 20 older source maps, including charts used by Christopher Columbus and documents dating back to the time of Alexander the Great, shows the coasts of Europe and North Africa with reasonable accuracy. However, it is the depiction of the Western Hemisphere that has ignited decades of debate. The map clearly outlines the eastern coast of South America, positioning it correctly relative to Africa, a feat that requires an accurate calculation of longitude, a mathematical problem that European navigators would not solve for another 2.5 centuries with the invention of the chronometer. The true anomaly of the Piri Reis map lies further south. At the bottom of the parchment, the coastline of South America continues seamlessly into a landmass that runs eastward. This landmass bears a striking resemblance to the coast of Queen Maud Land in Antarctica. The problem is that Antarctica was not officially discovered until 1820, more than 300 years after Piri Reis drew his map. Furthermore, the coastline depicted does not match the icy edge of the continent as it appears today, but rather the subglacial topography of the land underneath the ice shelf. This suggests that the source maps Piri Reis utilised were drawn at a time when the Antarctic coast was free of ice. Geological evidence indicates that the last time Queen Maud Land was in such a condition was approximately 4000 BC. The implication is staggering, suggesting that a seafaring civilization with the capability to map the globe and calculate longitude existed thousands of years before the known dawn of sophisticated maritime history. Skeptics argue that the landmass is simply a continuation of South America, bent to fit the shape of the parchment, or a depiction of the hypothetical Terra Australis Incognita that ancient geographers believed must exist to balance the landmasses of the north. Yet, the level of detail argues against mere imagination. The map includes mountain ranges in the interior of the South American continent that were not explored by Europeans until decades after the map was drawn. It depicts the Falkland Islands at the correct latitude, though they were not discovered until 1592. The projection used in the map appears to be an azimuthal equidistant projection, centered near Cairo, a sophisticated technique that requires advanced knowledge of spherical trigonometry. If Piri Reis merely copied older maps, as he wrote in his own marginalia, then the authors of those original charts possessed a knowledge of the Earth's geography that was lost to history for millennia, only to be rediscovered by modern satellites and seismic-sounding technology. The existence of the Piri Reis map forces a re-evaluation of the transmission of knowledge through the ages. It suggests that the Library of Alexandria and other ancient repositories may have held cartographic data from a pre-Ice Age civilization that mapped the entire globe. The map does not exist in a vacuum. It is part of a genre of impossible maps known as portolans. which appeared in the medieval period with accuracy far exceeding the navigational tools available at the time. The Orontius Phineus map of 1531, for instance, depicts Antarctica with rivers and mountain ranges, showing the continent completely ice-free. The Boachi map of 1737 shows Antarctica as two distinct islands separated by a waterway, a fact that was only confirmed in the 1950s during the International Geophysical Year. These documents hint at a legacy of exploration that predates our written history, pointing to a forgotten epoch where humanity had already encompassed the globe. Beneath the rolling hills of Zhejiang province in eastern China lies a subterranean mystery that defies engineering logic and historical record. The Longyu Caves are a massive complex of 24 artificially carved caverns, discovered accidentally in 1992 by a local villager attempting to drain a pond. What was initially thought to be a bottomless pit turned out to be a flooded entrance to an ancient underground world. As the water was pumped out, it revealed a man-made grotto of immense proportions carved directly into the siltstone. The scale of the excavation is monumental. The average floor area of each cave is over 1,000 square meters, with heights reaching up to 30 meters. The total volume of rock removed is estimated to be nearly 1 million cubic meters. Despite the magnitude of this project, which would have required a massive workforce and years of labor, there is not a single historical record, ancient text, or local legend that mentions the construction or purpose of these caves. The method of construction is equally baffling. The interiors of the Longyu Caves are not rough-hewn tunnels, but sophisticated architectural spaces. The ceilings, walls, and pillars are covered in uniform, parallel chisel marks. These striations are distinct and precise, maintaining a consistent angle and depth across thousands of square meters of surface area. This uniformity suggests the use of specialized tools or machinery, rather than simple hand chisels, which would naturally produce irregular patterns over such a vast canvas. The pillars that support the cavern roofs are arranged to ensure structural integrity, demonstrating an advanced understanding of load-bearing mechanics. Even more remarkably, the caves are not connected to one another. They exist in close proximity, sometimes separated by walls only 50 centimeters thick. Yet the builders never accidentally broke through to an adjacent cavern. This implies that they possessed precise surveying instruments to map the interior of the rock in 3 dimensions before excavation began. The purpose of the Longyu Caves remains a subject of intense speculation. They do not appear to be tombs, as no funerary objects or human remains were found. They are unlikely to be mines, as the siltstone removed was not a valuable building material, and there is no evidence of where the million cubic meters of debris were deposited. Some theories suggest they were granaries, citing the controlled temperature and humidity of the underground environment, but the sheer size and the artistic effort put into the chisel decorations seem excessive for mere storage. Others propose they were palaces for an ancient emperor or secret military bunkers, yet the lack of living quarters, kitchens, or ventilation shafts for smoke argues against long-term habitation. The caves were found flooded, and some researchers believe they were designed to be water reservoirs, part of an ancient irrigation system. However, the intricate carvings and the design of the pillars would have been submerged and invisible, rendering the artistic labour pointless. The preservation of the caves is another anomaly. Despite being flooded for centuries, perhaps millennia, the rock faces show little sign of erosion or collapse. The structural integrity has held firm against the weight of the hill above and the pressure of the water within. In a region prone to earthquakes and floods, the survival of these caverns suggests a level of engineering resilience that modern construction often fails to achieve. The Longyu Caves stand as a silent testament to a forgotten chapter of Chinese history, a project of pharaonic scale carried out by a civilization that chose to leave no signature, no date, and no explanation. They force us to question what other massive structures might lie hidden beneath the earth and water, erased from memory but preserved in stone. In the spring of 1900, a group of Greek sponge divers sought shelter from a storm off the coast of the small island of Antikythera, located between Kythera and Crete. While waiting for the winds to die down, they decided to dive the unfamiliar waters and stumbled upon an ancient shipwreck lying at a depth of 45 meters. The wreck, a Roman galley dating to the 1st century BC, was laden with bronze and marble statues, jewellery and glassware. Among these treasures was a lump of corroded bronze and wood. roughly the size of a shoebox, which was initially overlooked by the archaeologists processing the find. It sat in a museum storage room for 2 years until the wood dried out and split apart, revealing the unmistakable shape of a precision gear. This object, now known as the Antikythera Mechanism, is arguably the most technologically out-of-place artifact ever discovered. A computer from a time when computers should not have existed. The mechanism consists of at least 30 meshing bronze gears housed inside a wooden case roughly the size of a mantel clock. On its face were dials and pointers, and on the back spiral inscriptions. For decades, the complexity of the device baffled researchers, as gears of such precision were not thought to have been invented until the clockwork mechanisms of the Renaissance, more than 1,000 years later. It was not until the turn of the 21st century, when advanced X-ray tomography and high-resolution surface imaging were applied to the fragments, that the true function of the machine was revealed. The Antikythera Mechanism was an analog computer designed to predict astronomical positions and eclipses for calendrical and astrological purposes. It could track the movements of the Sun, the Moon, and the 5 planets known in antiquity: Mercury, Venus, Mars, Jupiter, and Saturn. The level of astronomical knowledge encoded in the gears is profound. The device incorporates the Metonic cycle, a 19-year period used to reconcile the lunar and solar calendars, and the Saros cycle, an 18-year period used to predict eclipses. It even accounts for the elliptical orbit of the Moon, using a pin and slot mechanism to vary the speed of the lunar pointer, mimicking the acceleration and deceleration of the Moon as it moves closer to and further from the Earth, a phenomenon described by Kepler's laws of planetary motion 17 centuries later. The mechanism also featured a dial indicating the 4-year cycle of the Pan-Hellenic Games, including the Olympics. The miniaturization of the gears, some with teeth only a millimeter long, implies a manufacturing technology and a tradition of complex mechanics that is completely absent from the archaeological record of the period. The existence of the Antikythera Mechanism creates a paradox in the history of technology. It appears as a solitary genius object, with no known prototypes and no direct successors. If the Greeks possessed the ability to build differential gears and analog computers in the 2nd century BC, why was this technology lost? Why did the Industrial Revolution not begin in ancient Athens or Rhodes? The complexity of the device suggests it was not a one-off prototype, but a refined product of a mature technological lineage. Cicero, the Roman orator, wrote of a similar device constructed by Archimedes and another by the Stoic philosopher Posidonius, suggesting that such machines may have been more common than we realize. The bronze of the mechanism survived only because it was buried in the anaerobic sediment of the sea floor. Countless others were likely melted down for their metal over the centuries, erasing the evidence of an ancient high-tech society. The Antikythera Mechanism forces us to rewrite the timeline of human innovation, proving that the path of progress is not a straight line but a jagged trajectory of invention, loss, and rediscovery. In the Diquís Delta of Costa Rica, amidst the dense tropical vegetation and banana plantations, lie hundreds of perfectly spherical stone balls, ranging in size from a few centimeters to over 2 meters in diameter and weighing up to 16 tons. These petrospheres are a marvel of prehistoric masonry. They were first reported in the 1930s by workers clearing the jungle for the United Fruit Company. Tragically, many of the spheres were destroyed by the workers, who believed that the stones contained gold in their centers and dynamited them or rolled them into ravines to clear the land. Those that remain present, one of the most perplexing archaeological mysteries of the Americas. The spheres are composed of granodiorite, a hard, igneous rock that does not occur naturally in the delta, meaning the raw material was transported from quarries located in the Talamanca Mountains, over 50 miles away. The primary mystery of the spheres is their geometric perfection. Many of the stones are within millimeters of being perfect spheres, a feat that is incredibly difficult to achieve with the stone tools available to the indigenous Tiki culture. To create a perfect sphere from a hard rock like granodiorite requires sophisticated measuring techniques and endless abrasion. Without metal tools or laser measurements, the sculptors would have had to rely on templates and constant rotation to ensure uniformity. The sheer number of spheres, estimated to be over 300, indicates a mass production effort driven by a significant cultural or religious imperative. However, because the spheres have been moved from their original locations, some now sit on the lawns of wealthy citizens or in front of government buildings, their original context and alignment have been lost. archaeologists have attempted to date the spheres by studying the stratigraphy of the excavation sites and the pottery shards found nearby, placing them anywhere between 300 BC and 1500 AD. Yet the stones themselves cannot be carbon dated, and the culture that created them left no written records. The purpose of the spheres remains entirely speculative. Some researchers suggest they were status symbols for tribal chiefs, lining the approaches to their houses. Others believe they served an astronomical function, arranged in patterns to track the movements of the stars or the sun, similar to Stonehenge. The variety in size and the precision of the curvature have led to more exotic theories, including the idea that the ancients possessed a technique to soften stone, or that the spheres are remnants of a lost civilization that predated the known tribes of Costa Rica. The logistics of transporting 16-ton blocks of stone through dense jungle, across rivers and swamps, without the use of the wheel or beasts of burden, is a testament to the organisational capacity of the builders. It implies a society with a surplus of labour and food, stable enough to dedicate years to the creation of abstract monuments. The stone spheres of Costa Rica challenge the perception of pre-Columbian societies in Central America as purely hunter-gatherer or simple agrarian groups. They reveal a people with a deep understanding of geometry and a desire to impose order and perfection on the natural world, leaving behind an enigma that modern science struggles to replicate or explain. In 1938, the German archaeologist Wilhelm König, then director of the National Museum of Iraq, made a peculiar discovery in the museum's archives. He found a collection of terracotta jars that had been excavated near the ancient city of Ctesiphon, dating back to the Parthian or Sassanid periods, roughly between 250 BC and 224 AD. Inside each jar was a copper cylinder, and suspended within the cylinder by an asphalt stopper was an iron rod. The arrangement looked suspiciously like a galvanic cell. König published a paper suggesting that these vessels were, in fact, ancient electric batteries. Subsequent experiments by engineers and historians have confirmed that if the jars were filled with an acidic liquid, such as vinegar, lemon juice or grape juice, they could generate a small electric current, typically between 1 and 2 volts. The implications of the Baghdad battery are revolutionary. If these jars were indeed used to generate electricity, it would mean that the principles of electromagnetism were discovered and utilised 2,000 years before Alessandro Volta invented the modern battery in 1800. The debate, however, centres on what the ancients would have used this electricity for. There are no records of electric lights or motors in the Parthian Empire. The most prevailing theory is that the batteries were used for electroplating, transferring a thin layer of gold or silver onto other metal objects. This technique is still used today in traditional jewellery making in the Middle East. If the Parthian silversmiths used these batteries to gild jewellery, they would have possessed a magical ability to turn base metals into gold, a secret trade that would have been closely guarded. Another theory suggests a medicinal use. In ancient times, the electric shock from torpedo fish was used to treat pain, particularly gout and headaches. It is possible that the batteries were linked together to produce a higher voltage, used by priests or healers to deliver a therapeutic shock to patients. Alternatively, the batteries could have been used in religious rituals. A metal idol connected to a hidden battery could deliver a startling shock to a worshipper who touched it, proving the power and presence of the deity. The magic of the temple would have been reinforced by this invisible force. Skeptics argue that the resemblance to a battery is coincidental, and that the jars were merely storage vessels for sacred scrolls, with the metal components serving a structural purpose. However, the specific combination of copper and iron, insulated by asphalt, is chemically ideal for creating a reaction, a configuration that seems unlikely to happen by chance. The corrosion found on the iron rods in the original artifacts is consistent with the presence of an acidic electrolyte. The Baghdad battery represents a classic example of out-of-place artifacts, suggesting that scientific knowledge in the ancient world was far more fragmented and advanced than the linear progression of history usually admits. It raises the possibility that electricity was a known phenomenon, utilised for specific crafts or rituals, but never industrialised or understood in a theoretical framework, eventually fading into obscurity until its rediscovery in the Enlightenment. In the Beinecke Rare Book and Manuscript Library at Yale University resides what has been called the world's most mysterious book. The Voynich manuscript, named after the Polish book dealer Wilfrid Voynich, who purchased it in 1912, is a small illustrated codex carbon dated to the early 15th century. It is written entirely in an unknown script and an unknown language that has resisted every attempt at decipherment by the world's greatest codebreakers, including the team at Bletchley Park who cracked the Enigma code during World War II. The manuscript contains 240 vellum pages filled with bizarre illustrations of non-existent plants, naked women bathing in green pools connected by intricate plumbing, astrological diagrams and pharmaceutical recipes. The text itself flows from left to right, with no punctuation, organised into paragraphs. The Voynich alphabet consists of between 20 and 30 distinct characters, with a few dozen rarer symbols. Statistical analysis of the text reveals that it follows the laws of natural language, such as Zipf's law, which governs the frequency distribution of words. The entropy of the text, the density of information, is similar to that of English or Latin. This suggests that the manuscript is not a random gibberish hoax, but a meaningful text written in a forgotten language or a sophisticated cipher. However, the structure of the words is peculiar. There are many repetitions and patterns that do not occur in European languages, leading some to speculate it may be a constructed language or a phonetic transcription of an East Asian or tonal language. The illustrations only deepen the mystery. The herbal section depicts plants that are chimeras, combining the roots of one species with the leaves of another and the flowers of a third. None of the plants can be definitively identified with known botanical species. The biological section shows small nude female figures emerging from pipes or interacting with strange organic tubes, imagery that has been interpreted as representing human reproduction, cellular biology, or alchemical processes. The astrological section features zodiac charts, but the symbols are often unconventional or modified. The pharmaceutical section depicts jars and vessels containing roots and leaves, suggesting a medicinal compendium. Theories regarding the manuscript's origin and purpose are endless. Some believe it is a medieval medical or alchemical treatise, encrypted to protect trade secrets. Others suggest it is a work of art brut or glossolalia, created by a single author channeling a private language. More fringe theories propose it is of extraterrestrial origin or a relic from a lost civilization. The physical evidence of the vellum and the pigments places it firmly in the Renaissance, yet the content seems completely alien to the intellectual context of that era. The Voynich manuscript remains a silent fortress, a testament to the fact that even in an age of information, there are still secrets that we cannot unlock. Knowledge that is right before our eyes yet utterly inaccessible. The mystery of the Voynich manuscript extends far beyond the physical pages and into a labyrinthine history of ownership, a chain of custody that reads like a historical thriller. While Wilfrid Voynich is the figure who brought the codex into the modern public consciousness, the book's journey before 1912 is as enigmatic as its contents. Inside the front cover, visible only under ultraviolet light, lies the faded signature of Jacobus Sinapius, the personal physician to Rudolf II, the Holy Roman Emperor. This places the manuscript in the heart of the Prague court in the early 17th century, a hub of alchemical obsession and occult study. Included with the manuscript when Voynich purchased it was a letter dated 1666 from Johannes Marcus Marci, the rector of Charles University in Prague, to Athanasius Kircher, a Jesuit scholar in Rome famous for his, often incorrect, attempts to decipher Egyptian hieroglyphs. In this letter, Marci claims that the book was once owned by Emperor Rudolf II, who purchased it for the staggering sum of 600 gold ducats, believing it to be the work of Roger Bacon, the 13th century English friar and philosopher. Bacon was a convenient candidate for such a work. He was known for his interest in encryption and the natural sciences, and his reputation for wizardry made him a likely author of magical texts. However, the carbon dating of the vellum to the early 1400s, more than a century after Bacon's death, makes this attribution impossible, unless one assumes the scribe used vellum that had been sitting in storage for over 100 years, a highly unlikely scenario given the expense of materials in the medieval period. The letter to Kircher reveals that the manuscript was baffling scholars as early as the 1600s. It had passed from the emperor to his court alchemist Georg Beresch, who, in despair over his inability to read it, described it as a sphinx that occupied his space uselessly. Beresch sent sample transcriptions to Kircher, hoping the Jesuit's intellect could crack the code. It failed. Upon Beresch's death, the book passed to Marci and then to Kircher, before disappearing into the archives of the Collegio Romano for 2.5 centuries, until Voynich uncovered it in a chest of books being sold by the Jesuits to fund the restoration of their villa. This provenanced history confirms that the manuscript is not a modern forgery created by Voynich himself, a theory once popular among skeptics. The Sphinx has been mute for over 600 years. To understand why the text resists decipherment, one must delve deeper into the mechanics of Voynichese. The script is not merely a substitution cipher, where one symbol replaces a letter of a known alphabet. If it were, simple frequency analysis, counting the most common symbols and matching them to the most common letters of a likely source language like Latin or Italian, would have solved it long ago. Instead, the text exhibits a structural complexity that defies standard linguistic categorization. The alphabet, transcribed by modern researchers using a system called EVA, European Voynich alphabet, consists of characters that look deceptive. There are gallows characters that rise above the line, resembling the letter T or K, and round characters that resemble O or A. However, the behaviour of these characters is alien. In English, the letter A can appear at the beginning, middle, or end of a word. In Voynichese, certain characters appear almost exclusively at the beginning of lines, others only at the ends of words, and some never appear next to each other. This rigid positional structure is more reminiscent of Semitic abjads, like Arabic or Hebrew, or even East Asian scripts than it is of European alphabets. Furthermore, the words in the manuscript are incredibly repetitive. A word might appear 3 times in a row, or vary by only a single character. For example, a sequence might read Choldain Dain Chol Choldain. This level of redundancy is extremely rare in human speech or writing. If translated to English, it would look like the house, the house. This has led some computational linguists to suggest that the text might be a verbose cipher, where a single letter of plaintext is represented by a whole word in Voynichese, or that it functions like a chant or mantra, where the rhythm and repetition are more important than the semantic content. The manuscript is also divided by 2 distinct hands, or writing styles, known as Courier A and Courier B, named after the US Navy cryptographer Prescott Currier, who identified them in the 1970s. The shift between these 2 styles corresponds with changes in the statistical properties of the text. It is as if 2 different scribes wrote the book, using slightly different dialects or spelling conventions. Courier B, for instance, is written in a more open, expansive hand, while Courier A is tighter and more angular. The existence of 2 scribes complicates the madman theory, the idea that a single schizophrenic author invented a private language. A shared delusion or a shared secret language between 2 people suggests a school, a cult, or a professional tradition. The visual enigmas of the manuscript are just as perplexing as the textual ones. While the botanical section gets much attention for its Frankenstein plants, the so-called balneological section is perhaps the most disturbing and unique. Here, the text is surrounded by images of nude women, often referred to as nymphs, bathing in complex networks of green liquid. They stand in tubs, slide down chutes, and are interconnected by tubes that resemble internal organs. The women are drawn with swollen bellies, leading to the theory that this section is a treatise on gynecology, obstetrics, or the medieval understanding of the humours. The green liquid could represent bile, or perhaps medicinal waters. In the Middle Ages, balneology, the therapeutic use of baths, was a common medical practice, but no other known manuscript depicts it with such surreal, biomechanical plumbing. The figures are devoid of religious iconography. There are no crosses, no saints, and no demons, which is startling for a European text of the 15th century. It is a secular, biological, and oddly isolated world. Then there is the rosettes fold-out, a large page that unfolds to reveal a complex circular diagram. It depicts 9 circles connected by causeways, with a castle or city in the centre. The architecture of the castle walls includes swallowtail merlons, a style common in northern Italy in the early Renaissance. This architectural clue is one of the few tethers anchoring the manuscript to a specific geographic reality. However, the surrounding geography is nonsensical, featuring floating volcanoes and impossible perspective. Is it a map of the world? A diagram of the solar system? A representation of the cellular structure of life? Some researchers have tried to overlay the rosettes on maps of medieval Milan or Jerusalem, but the fit is never perfect, always requiring a leap of faith. One of the most compelling modern theories regarding the text challenges the idea that it is European at all. The New World hypothesis suggests that the manuscript might be of Aztec origin. created in Mexico shortly after the Spanish conquest. Proponents of this theory point to the botanical section, arguing that some of the plants previously unidentified bear a striking resemblance to New World flora like sunflowers and cacti, which were unknown in Europe before 1492. If the vellum was brought to the New World, or the text was written on old European stock by a missionary or an indigenous scribe trained in Latin script, the strange language could be a phonetic transcription of Nahuatl, the Aztec language. Nahuatl is an agglutinative language, where words are built by stringing together prefixes, roots, and suffixes, a structure that could explain the repetitive, prefix-heavy nature of Voynishese. However, this theory clashes with the carbon dating of the vellum to the early 1400s, requiring us to believe the vellum sat unused for a century before being transported across the Atlantic, a logistical improbability that keeps this theory on the fringe. Conversely, the hoax theory remains a stubborn contender. In 2004, computer scientist Gordon Rugg demonstrated that the complex structure of Voynishese could be replicated using a Renaissance encryption device called a card and grill. By moving a card with holes cut in it over a table of syllables, one can generate text that follows Zipf's law and looks linguistically complex but is actually meaningless gibberish. This would explain why the text has no corrections. The scribe was simply copying generated nonsense, not struggling with a complex thought process. If the Voynich manuscript is a hoax, it is not a modern one, but a contemporary medieval one, perhaps created to swindle the gold-hungry Emperor Rudolf II, who we know paid a fortune for it. It would be the ultimate con, a book of nothing that looks like a book of everything, yet the hoax theory fails to explain the labour intensity. The illustrations, while crude, are detailed and coloured with paints derived from minerals consistent with the 1400s. The handwriting is fluid, rapid, and confident. There are no signs of hesitation, no pauses to calculate the next random word. To maintain such a consistent, complex yet meaningless structure over 240 pages would be a feat of mental endurance rivaling the creation of a real language. The sheer cost of the vellum, requiring the skins of an entire herd of calves, argues against a casual prank. In the age of artificial intelligence, the Voynich manuscript has become a testing ground for machine learning. Neural networks trained on hundreds of languages have been unleashed on the text. In 2018, a Canadian team claimed their AI identified the underlying language as Hebrew, enciphered using ordered anagrams. Other algorithms have pointed towards Proto-Romance or Creolized Latin. However, these AI solutions often produce translations that are incoherent, requiring massive subjective interpretation to make sense. The computer sees patterns, but it cannot find the key because it assumes a logical intent that may not exist. The AI is essentially hallucinating meaning from noise, much like humans have done for a century. The manuscript acts as a mirror for the observer. A botanist looks at it and sees a herbal, an astronomer sees a star map, a linguist sees a lost dialect, a cryptographer sees a code. It reflects our own desire to find order in chaos. The text has been translated dozens of times, yet each translation is mutually exclusive. One week it is a recipe for the elixir of life. The next it is a diary of a Catha heretic. This malleability is perhaps its most defining feature. The tragedy of the Voynich manuscript is that it resides in the uncanny valley of communication. It is too structured to be noise, yet too alien to be read. It sits behind glass in the Beneke Library, a silent testament to the limits of human understanding. We live in a world where we believe every problem has a solution, every code has a key, and every lock has a pick. The Voynich manuscript challenges this positivist arrogance. It posits the possibility that knowledge can be lost irrevocably. It reminds us that culture is fragile. If a language is spoken by a secretive subsect of medieval alchemists, and they all die without passing on the cipher, their knowledge evaporates, leaving behind only the husk of their writing. Ultimately, the manuscript remains a silent fortress because it lacks a Rosetta Stone. The decipherment of Egyptian hieroglyphs relied on the Greek translation. The cracking of Enigma relied on captured codebooks and operator error. The Voynich manuscript exists in a vacuum. There are no external references, no other books written in this script, no bilingual tablets. Unless a second book is found in a dusty European attic, or a crib sheet is discovered in the binding of another volume, the Voynich manuscript may remain the only book in the world that cannot be read. It is a lonely object, a singular point of data in the vast library of human history, waiting for a reader who may never be born. Until then, It keeps its secrets, its nymphs bathing in their green pools, its stars spinning in unknown skies, and its words flowing across the vellum, speaking a message that no living ear can hear. Off the southernmost coast of the Ryukyu Islands in Japan, near the island of Yonaguni, lies a submerged rock formation that has sparked a fierce geological and archaeological debate. Discovered in 1987 by a dive tour operator looking for new, shark-watching sites, the Yonaguni Monument is a massive sandstone structure that looks strikingly like a man-made step pyramid or ziggurat. The formation measures over 150 metres in length and 40 metres in width, rising 27 metres from the sea floor. It features sharp, right-angled edges, flat terraces, vertical walls, and what appear to be carved steps, pillars, and a road loop surrounding the base. The controversy centres on whether the monument is a natural geological phenomenon or a relic of an ancient civilization. Marine geologists who argue for a natural origin point to the fact that the rock is composed of sandstone and mudstone, which naturally fracture along plains to create straight lines and flat surfaces. They argue that tectonic activity and strong currents could have shaped the rock into its current geometric form over thousands of years. However, proponents of the artificial theory, including the late Professor Masaki Kimura of the University of the Ryukyus, argue that the complexity of the structure defies natural explanation. They point to specific features such as two round holes carved into the rock that resemble post holes, a triangular pool with a drainage channel, and a massive rock carved into the shape of a turtle. If the Yonaguni monument is man-made, it radically alters the timeline of history in the region. The structure is currently submerged, and sea levels in this area have not been low enough to expose the land since the end of the last ice age, approximately 10,000 to 12,000 years ago. This would imply that the monument was built by a civilization that existed long before the earliest known Japanese cultures, such as the Jomon. It would suggest a sophisticated society capable of monumental architecture existed in the Pacific at a time when humans were thought to be simple hunter-gatherers. This aligns with the lost continent of Mu hypothesis, though most academics dismiss this as pseudo-archaeology. The site remains an enigma because it sits on the razor's edge between nature and artifice. Nature rarely creates right angles and distinct pathways, yet the power of the ocean is capable of sculpting bizarre forms. The Japanese government does not recognise the site as a cultural artefact, leaving its protection and study to private researchers and universities. Whether it is a masterpiece of ancient engineering lost to the rising seas or a geological curiosity, the Yonaguni monument serves as a reminder of how much of our planet's history is hidden beneath the waves, potentially concealing the ruins of the chapters of humanity that were washed away by the melting of the ice caps. To descend into the waters of Yonaguni is to enter a realm where the certainty of modern science collides with the silence of deep time. The experience of the dive itself is often overshadowed by the academic controversy, yet the physical reality of the site is crucial to understanding the debate. The monument sits in a region of the East China Sea known for its treacherous currents. The Kuroshio Current, a powerful oceanic conveyor belt, rips past the island, bringing with it schools of hammerhead sharks and visibility that can exceed 30 metres. It is this clarity that allows divers to see the sheer scale of the pyramid, a monolithic shadow rising from the azure depths, dominating the seascape with a presence that feels undeniably architectural. The primary point of contention lies in the geological phenomenon known as orthogonal jointing. Skeptics, including geologist Robert Schoch of Boston University, who famously redated the Great Sphinx of Giza based on water erosion patterns, initially approached Yonaguni with an open mind, but concluded that the structure is primarily natural. Sandstone, particularly in seismically active zones like the Pacific Ring of Fire, has a tendency to fracture along parallel and perpendicular planes. When tectonic stresses are applied to a layered sedimentary block, it can snap cleanly, leaving behind smooth faces and sharp corners that mimic human masonry. The steps of the monument, Schoch argues, are simply the result of erosion stripping away softer layers of rock from harder ones, a process intensified by the relentless scouring of the ocean currents and typhoons that have battered this coastline for millennia. In this view, the Yonaguni monument is a Rorschach test on a planetary scale. Humans are pattern-seeking animals. We're evolutionarily wired to recognize geometry and order in chaos. When we see a straight line in nature, we instinctively look for the ruler that drew it. The skeptics argue that the terraces are too irregular to be practical for human use, with riser heights varying wildly and steps that lead to nowhere. They posit that if this were a fortress or a temple, the logic of its construction would be more apparent, its symmetry more precise. They suggest that the drainage channels are merely widened natural fissures, and that the pillars are simply harder nodules of rock that resisted erosion while the surrounding stone wore away. However, the natural explanation struggles to account for the sheer concentration of anomalies at the site. It is not just one right angle, but hundreds, clustered in a specific area, while the surrounding seabed is chaotic and irregular. Professor Kimura's decades of mapping have revealed a complex that extends far beyond the main monument. He has identified what he describes as a stadium-like enclosure, retaining walls and road-like structures that connect different features of the site. Perhaps the most compelling argument against the purely natural theory is the terraforming hypothesis. This middle ground theory suggests that while the base structure may be geological, it was modified and shaped by human hands. This practice, known as distinct or enhanced natural topography, is common in ancient cultures. The Incas, for example, often integrated living rock into their masonry, blurring the line between mountain and wall. In the context of a Paleolithic or Neolithic culture in East Asia, it is entirely plausible that an ancient people found a natural rock formation that commanded a view of the southern horizon and carved it further to accentuate its shape, creating a platform for worship or celestial observation. This would explain the lack of mortar or loose blocks. The building was not constructed, but subtracted from the bedrock. The specific features Kimura highlights require a suspension of disbelief to attribute solely to the random violence of the ocean. The loop road, a pathway roughly 6 meters wide that encircles the base of the monument, maintains a consistent width that seems inconsistent with random erosion. Furthermore, the post holes, two perfectly circular depressions carved into the rock terrace, are difficult to explain geologically. While marine organisms like sea urchins can bore holes in rock, they rarely do so in pairs of such geometric precision. If these were indeed post holes, they imply a wooden superstructure that once sat atop the stone foundation, a temple or pavilion that has long since rotted away, leaving only its footprint in the stone. Then there are the artistic interpretations. Divers have identified a massive rock formation resembling a turtle, and another that looks uncannily like a human face, oriented to stare upwards toward the surface. While pareidolia, seeing faces in random objects, is a valid counter-argument, the proximity of these sculptures to the main terrace invites speculation about a ceremonial complex. If the site was a place of animistic worship, the enhancement of natural rock shapes to resemble sacred animals would fit perfectly with the spiritual practices of early Asian cultures. The timing of the site's submergence links Yonaguni to a global mystery, the end of the Younger Dryas period, and the rapid sea level rise that occurred between 10,000 and 8,000 BCE. If the monument is man-made, it was built when Yonaguni was part of a land bridge connecting the Ryukyu Arc to the Asian mainland, or at least when the islands were much larger, and the distance between them navigable by simple craft. This era coincides with the Jomon period in Japan, a culture of hunter-gatherers who produced the world's earliest known pottery. The Jomon are traditionally viewed as semi-sedentary, living in pit dwellings and small villages. Attributing a megalithic structure like Yonaguni to the early Jomon challenges the standard model of social evolution. Monumental architecture requires a stratified society, a surplus of food to feed a labour force, and a centralised authority to direct construction, features not typically associated with the early Jomon. However, recent discoveries, such as the Göbekli Tepe site in Turkey, have shattered the assumption that hunter-gatherers could not build massive stone structures. Göbekli Tepe, dated to roughly 9500 BCE, proves that monumentalism predates agriculture. If hunter-gatherers in Anatolia could build complex stone temples, is it impossible that a coastal culture in the Pacific did the same? The implications of Yonaguni extend to the Kelpsip Highway theory of human migration. Anthropologists increasingly believe that the first Americans followed the coastline of the Pacific Rim from Asia to the Americas, relying on the rich marine resources of the kelp forests. A sophisticated maritime culture in the Ryukyu Islands during the Ice Age would have been a critical node in this migration. If Yonaguni is a relic of such a culture, it serves as evidence of a lost chapter of human history. a coastal civilization that thrived on the continental shelves before the glaciers melted and drowned their world. The resistance to recognizing Yonaguni as a cultural site is partly political and partly practical. Archaeology is a discipline of context. Without pottery shards, tools, or organic remains found in situ, dating a stone structure is nearly impossible. The ocean currents at Yonaguni are so strong that they sweep away any loose sediment or artifacts that might have settled in the crevices. We are left with only the bare stone. Furthermore, the Japanese government is hesitant to designate the site as a cultural treasure, because doing so would require a commitment to its protection and study, a costly endeavour for a site that lies in deep, dangerous waters. It is safer, bureaucratically, to classify it as a natural curiosity. Yet, the silence of the official channels does not dampen the intrigue. The site has become a focal point for alternative historians who argue that the history of civilization is older and more complex than we admit. They point to similarities between Yonaguni and the terrestrial rock-hewn architecture of Peru, Egypt and India. The sheer scale of the monument, 27 metres high, rivals the great edifices of antiquity. If it is a ziggurat, it is one that predates the ziggurats of Mesopotamia by thousands of years. The geological counter-narrative, while robust, often fails to address the why of the cultural rejection. There is a deep-seated reluctance in the scientific community to accept submerged ruins because they imply a catastrophic discontinuity in human history. We prefer the narrative of gradual progress, from caves to huts to cities. The idea that a sophisticated culture could rise and then be utterly erased by the sea, leaving only enigmatic bedrock scars, is unsettling. It suggests that our current civilization, hugging the coastlines of the world, is equally vulnerable. Current research techniques are beginning to peel back the layers of the mystery. Multi-beam sonar mapping and 3D photogrammetry are creating high-resolution digital models of the seafloor, allowing researchers to study the topography without the dangers of diving. These models have revealed that the monument is not isolated. It is part of a continuous ridge of rock that exhibits similar, though less dramatic, fracturing. However, the models also highlight the stark difference between the monument and the surrounding geology, reinforcing the idea that this specific section was geologically unique or artificially modified. Perhaps the most plausible explanation is a convergence of factors. Nature provided the canvas, a block of sandstone prone to fracturing in straight lines. The ancient inhabitants of Yonaguni, possessing a spiritual worldview that saw the divine in the landscape, recognized the potential of this formation. Over generations, they may have cleared away the loose debris, widened the natural fissures into channels, leveled the terraces for processions, and carved post holes for temporary wooden shrines. It was likely a sacred promontory, a place to look out over the Pacific, long before it was a submerged ruin. When the seas began to rise at the end of the Ice Age, the site would have been slowly abandoned. One can imagine the priests and the people watching as the waves claimed their temple, step by step, year by year. Eventually it slipped beneath the surface, protected from the wind and rain, but subjected to the slow, grinding erosion of the currents. Today, the Yonaguni monument remains a silent testament to the unknown. It is a place where the lines are blurred, between rock and wall, between nature and architect, between history and myth. Whether it was shaped by the tectonic heave of the earth or the chisel of a forgotten mason, its power lies in its ability to force us to question the solidity of our own timeline. It reminds us that the map of the ancient world is incomplete, with vast territories labelled "Here There Be Dragons," simply because they are currently underwater. The monument waits in the blue gloom, a giant riddle carved in stone, challenging the next generation of explorers to find the key that unlocks the silence of the prehistoric Pacific. High in the arid plateau of the Nazca Desert in southern Peru, the Earth itself has been turned into a canvas. Spanning an area of nearly 400 square miles are the Nazca Lines, a series of ancient geoglyphs etched into the desert floor. Created by the Nazca culture between 500 BC and 500 AD, these lines are formed by removing the reddish-brown iron oxide-coated pebbles that cover the surface of the desert to reveal the light-coloured earth underneath. The result is a collection of hundreds of simple lines and geometric shapes, and over 70 zoomorphic designs of animals, including a hummingbird, a spider, a monkey, a whale, and a condor. Some of these figures are colossal, measuring up to 100 to 200 feet across. The sheer scale of the Nazca lines is their most baffling characteristic. The figures are so large that they cannot be fully appreciated, or in some cases even recognized from the ground. They are best viewed from the air, which has led to the inevitable question: who were these lines built for? Since the Nazca people did not possess aircraft, it is often suggested that the lines were intended to be seen by the gods in the sky. They may have served as part of ritual processions, where the people would walk the lines of the figures as a form of worship or prayer for rain in one of the driest places on Earth. The geometric precision of the lines is remarkable. Some straight lines run for 30 miles without deviating, traversing hills and ravines with unwavering accuracy. Recent research using drones and AI has discovered dozens of new, smaller geoglyphs on the hillsides, predating the famous valley floor figures. These older carvings often depict humanoid figures and warriors, suggesting a shift in cultural focus over the centuries. The purpose of the lines has been debated for decades. Maria Reicher, the mathematician who dedicated her life to studying the lines, believed they were a massive astronomical calendar, pointing to the rising and setting of suns and stars. Others argue they are related to water sources, mapping underground aquifers in the parched desert. While the ancient astronaut theorists claim they were runways for aliens, the archaeological evidence points to a deeply religious human effort, a desperate plea to the heavens written in the language of the earth. The Nazca lines remain a testament to human persistence and the desire to communicate with the divine, a message that has outlasted the civilization that wrote it. The enigma of the Nazca lines extends far beyond their visual grandeur. It reaches into the very engineering prowess and social stratification of the people who created them. To understand the lines, one must look past the what and delve into the how and the why, moving from the aerial perspective back down to the dusty sun-baked earth where the Nazca people lived and died. The engineering required to execute these massive geoglyphs without aerial oversight is a testament to the Nazca culture's sophisticated grasp of geometry and cooperative labour. Experimental archaeology has demonstrated that these figures were likely created using a system of stakes and ropes. By establishing a central axis or a series of plotted points, the builders could scale up small drawings, perhaps sketched on textiles or scratched into pottery, into the colossal figures we see today. Remnants of Huarango wood stakes, carbon dated to the Nazca period, have been found at the extremities of some lines, confirming this method of terrestrial surveying. This suggests a society with a specialized class of priests or engineers who directed the lay people in the scorching heat, turning the desert floor into a vast, sacred grid. The preservation of these lines for 2 millennia is a geological miracle as much as an anthropological one. The Pampa de Jumana, the plateau where the lines reside, is one of the most stable environments on the planet. It is not merely the lack of rain, though the region receives less than an inch of precipitation a year, but the specific composition of the soil that protects the glyphs. The ground is covered in a layer of pebbles coated with iron and manganese oxide, darkened by thousands of years of oxidation. Beneath this thin, dark crust lies a sublayer of lighter, gypsum-rich clay. When the stones are removed to create the lines, the gypsum in the exposed soil absorbs moisture from the morning mist and hardens, essentially cementing the lines in place. Furthermore, the dark stones on the surface absorb intense solar heat, creating a cushion of warm air that acts as a shield against the wind, preventing the lines from being scrubbed away by sandstorms. The desert, in its hostility, became the perfect museum. However, the purpose of this open-air museum was likely far more dynamic than a static display for the gods. Recent archaeological theories have shifted away from the idea that the lines were only meant to be seen. Instead, they were meant to be experienced. The lines are remarkably continuous. Most of the zoomorphic figures, like the monkey or the spider, are drawn with a single, unbroken line that never crosses itself. This structural characteristic strongly supports the theory that the lines were ritual pathways. The Nazca people likely walked these paths in single-file processions, chanting, playing ceramic panpipes, and smashing pottery at specific intervals as offerings. The geoglyph was not just a picture, it was a labyrinthine stage for a kinetic ritual, a prayer performed with the feet. This performative aspect connects the lines to Kawachi, the massive ceremonial centre located just south of the Pampa. Kawachi was a city of adobe pyramids and plazas that dominated the Nazca spiritual landscape. It was not a residential city but a pilgrimage site, swelling with population during religious festivals and emptying out afterward. The relationship between the lines and Kawachi suggests a society deeply concerned with the cycles of life and death, and most importantly, the scarcity of water. The Nazca civilization flourished in a hyper-arid environment where survival hung by a thread. Every drop of water from the Andes Mountains had to be managed with desperate precision. This necessity gave rise to the water cult theory, which has gained significant traction among modern scholars. While Maria Reich focused on the astronomical alignments, later researchers like David Johnson proposed that the geometric lines, the trapezoids and triangles, map subterranean water sources. The faults in the earth that channel groundwater often align with the geoglyphs. In this view, the lines are a giant user manual for the desert, marking the flow of aquifers essential for agriculture. The zoomorphic figures also fit this narrative. The spider and the monkey are Amazonian symbols associated with rain, while the hummingbird is often seen as a messenger to the mountain gods who control the weather. The killer whale, or orca, a frequent motif in both the lines and Nazca pottery, represents a powerful deity of the sea, often depicted holding a trophy head, linking the abundance of the ocean with the ferocity required to survive. The discovery of trophy heads adds a macabre dimension to the beauty of the lines. The Nazca were a warrior culture that practiced ritual decapitation. Excavations have revealed caches of mummified heads, lips pinned shut with cactus spines, buried near the lines and within Kawachi. Bioarchaeological analysis indicates that these were not always enemies captured in war, but often local members of the community. This suggests that the lines were part of a sacrificial economy. In years of severe drought, caused by the cyclical El Niño phenomenon which disrupts the climate, the Nazca may have walked the lines to offer blood to the parched earth, hoping to appease the weeping gods. The sheer number of lines may represent a crescendo of panic as the civilization neared its collapse, a frantic, multi-generational scribbling on the earth in a bid to stop the desert from consuming them. Technological advancements are now peeling back layers of the desert that the naked eye missed for centuries. The application of artificial intelligence to satellite imagery and drone surveys has led to a renaissance in Nazca archaeology. In recent years, researchers from Yamagata University in Japan have identified over 140 new geoglyphs. These newly discovered figures are often smaller and older than the famous animal shapes. They are located on hillsides rather than the flat valley floor, meaning they were visible to people on the ground. These older glyphs, often attributed to the Paracas culture, the predecessors of the Nazca, depict humanoid figures, warriors, and strange feline-like creatures. This distinction marks a profound cultural shift. The Paracas people carved for each other, creating monuments to be seen from the villages below, while the Nazca people turned their gaze upward, carving for the gods in the vast flat void of the pampa, where only the sky could bear witness. One of the most striking recent finds was a massive 120-foot-long cat, etched into a hillside, which had faded nearly to invisibility before being digitally reconstructed. These discoveries suggest that the practice of geoglyph creation evolved over 1,000 years, changing in style, scale, and intent. It implies that the Pampa is a palimpsest, a manuscript written over and over again, with newer lines often cutting through older ones, disregarding the work of ancestors in favour of new, more urgent prayers. Despite their resilience against nature, the Nazca lines are incredibly fragile in the face of the Anthropocene. The isolation that protected them for 2 millennia is gone. The Pan-American Highway, built before the full extent of the lines was understood, slices directly through the tail of the great lizard figure, a permanent scar of modernity. Squatters and illegal miners encroach on the protected zones, leaving tyre tracks that destroy the delicate surface patina, tracks that, in this changeless environment, can last for centuries. The political instability and economic needs of modern Peru often clash with preservation efforts. In 2014, activists from Greenpeace sparked international outrage when they entered the prohibited area around the hummingbird to lay down a banner damaging the pristine surface near the figure. This incident highlighted the tension between the lines as a global heritage symbol and their physical reality as a delicate, unguarded layer of dust. Furthermore, the climate change that likely destroyed the Nazca civilization is coming full circle. While the desert has been dry for thousands of years, changing global weather patterns are bringing more frequent and intense rain to the Atacama and Sechura deserts. Water is the eraser of the Nazca lines. The gypsum that cements the soil dissolves in heavy rain, and the runoff from the Andes can scour the pampa, washing away the dark stones that define the images. If the region becomes wetter, the lines could fade into the background noise of the desert floor within a few decades, erasing the history of a people who prayed for the very water that might eventually destroy their legacy. The legacy of the Nazca lines also extends into the realm of modern art and land use. They challenge our definition of monumentalism. Unlike the pyramids of Giza or the Great Wall of China, which are additive structures built up from the ground, the Nazca lines are subtractive. They are defined by what is removed, not what is added. They are a monument of negative space. This conceptual brilliance resonates with the land art movement of the 20th century, inspiring artists like Robert Smithson and Michael Heiser. The Nazca people understood that the canvas of the earth itself was the medium, and that scale could be used to transcend the human perspective. Ultimately, the Nazca lines stand as a haunting memorial to a civilization that lived on the edge of survival. They are a graphic record of a society's dialogue with its environment. Whether they were mapping the stars to predict the harvest, mapping the aquifers to find water, or mapping the spiritual path of the soul, they represent a collective effort of immense proportions. The silence of the desert today belies the activity that once took place there, the sound of chanting, the rhythm of feet on the hard-packed earth, and the breaking of pots. We may never fully decipher the exact syntax of this desert language, but the intent is clear. It is a declaration of presence. In the vast, indifferent emptiness of the cosmos, the Nazca people shouted, "We are here," and they wrote it so large that even the stars could not ignore it. The mystery is not just in the lines themselves, but in the enduring human capacity to find meaning in the dust, to organize chaos into geometry. High in the Peruvian Andes, overlooking the imperial city of Cusco, lies a site that challenges our understanding of physics and logistical capability even more aggressively than the lines etched into the Nazca Desert. This is Sacsayhuaman, a fortress temple complex that serves as the ultimate example of Inca engineering, though some argue its foundations may predate the Inca Empire by thousands of years. The site is defined by its 3 terraced walls, which zigzag across the landscape in a pattern often compared to the teeth of a puma or the jagged strike of lightning. What arrests the observer immediately is not merely the shape of the walls, but the sheer impossible mass of the stones used to construct them. Unlike the standard brick-and-mortar construction found in most ancient ruins, Sacsayhuaman is built from massive blocks of limestone, some weighing as much as 300 tons, standing over 25 feet tall. The central mystery of Sacsayhuaman is the method of construction. These colossal stones were not quarried on site, but were transported from quarries several miles away, a journey that involved traversing uneven, mountainous terrain and crossing river ravines. We are told by mainstream archaeology that the Inca achieved this using ropes, logs, and thousands of labourers pushing and pulling in unison. While this explanation is plausible for smaller stones, the physics of moving a 300-ton uneven boulder up a steep Andean slope without the use of the wheel, draft animals, or iron tools strains the limits of credibility. Even if the transport were possible, the placement of the stones remains an even greater enigma. The blocks are not uniform bricks, they're irregular polygons, each with a unique shape, yet they fit together with such terrifying precision that a single sheet of paper cannot be inserted between them. The joinery here is of a quality that modern stonemasons, equipped with diamond-tipped saws and computer-aided design software, would struggle to replicate. The stones are interlocked in 3 dimensions, meaning they are not just stacked flat on top of one another, but are keyed into each other with protruding nubs and corresponding indentations. This creates a structure that is virtually earthquake-proof. When the devastating earthquakes of 1650 and 1950 leveled the Spanish colonial buildings in Cusco, the walls of Sacsayhuaman remained immovable, their stones dancing slightly in their sockets before settling back into their perfect alignment. The Spanish conquistadors, upon seeing the fortress, were so baffled by its construction that they believed it to be the work of demons, unable to comprehend how savages without iron or writing could architect such a marvel. They spent decades dismantling the site to build their own churches and houses, but they only managed to take the smaller stones. The megalithic foundation blocks were simply too heavy to move, leaving the core of the mystery intact. Some researchers have proposed the controversial theory that the builders possessed a technique to soften stone. This hypothesis draws upon local folklore and the observations of early explorers who reported seeing a reddish sludge near construction sites, or hearing legends of a plant extract capable of making rock malleable. If the stones were softened, they could have been moulded into place like clay, explaining the pillowy, vitrified appearance of the stone faces and the seamless mortar-free joints. While geologists generally dismiss this idea, pointing to the lack of chemical evidence, the visual inspection of the stones often leaves one with the uncanny impression that they were once in a semi-liquid state, slumping into one another under their own weight before hardening for eternity. Beyond the immediate visceral shock of the stones themselves lies the broader context of Sacsayhuaman's design, which reveals a cosmological sophistication that rivals the engineering. To understand the fortress, one must understand the shape of Cusco itself, for the city was not merely a collection of buildings, but a sacred effigy laid out upon the earth. The Incas, or perhaps their predecessors, designed the capital in the shape of a crouching puma, the supreme earthly deity in Andean cosmology, representing power and the physical world, or Caipacha. The Coricancha, the temple of the sun, formed the genitalia of the beast. The convergence of the two rivers formed the tail, the main plaza was the belly, and Sacsayhuaman, perched high on the hill, formed the head. The zigzag walls that define the site are not merely defensive ramparts designed to deflect arrows and sling stones. They are the teeth of the puma, bared in a snarl against the enemies of the Tawantinsuyu. This zoomorphic architecture implies that the site was less a military garrison and more a spiritual crown, a place where the Inca, the living son of the sun, would commune with the forces of lightning and thunder. The orientation of the walls supports this, as the shadows cast by the zigzags during the solstices create dramatic shapes that mimic the jagged path of Illapa, the thunder god traversing the earth. As we delve deeper into the site's anatomy, we encounter the mystery of the Muyuk Maka, the circular foundations that sit atop the megalithic walls. While the Spanish dismantled the towers that once stood here to build their cathedral in the valley below, the bases remain, revealing a complex system of concentric circles and water channels. Historians have long debated the function of these towers, with Garcilaso de la Vega, the son of a Spanish captain and an Inca princess, describing a great tower filled with gold and silver imagery, a place of housing for the royal court. However, modern archaeoastronomy suggests a dual purpose: a water reservoir and a solar observatory. The precise channels carved into the rock indicate a mastery of hydrodynamics, allowing water to be pumped or siphoned up to the high ground, perhaps to create reflecting pools for observing the stars. The Incas believed that the stars were not just points of light, but reflections of the sacred river, the Milky Way or Mayu, and by capturing the reflection of the night sky in still water, the shaman astronomers could predict the agricultural cycles with absolute precision. This integration of water, stone and sky points to a technology of the sacred, where utility and spirituality were indistinguishable. Yet, the most unsettling aspect of Sacsayhuaman lies not in what is visible, but in what is hidden. The site is honeycombed with a labyrinth of tunnels known as chincanas. These subterranean passages are carved directly into the limestone bedrock, connecting the fortress to the Coricancha temple in the city below, and, according to legend, to other sites miles away. The Chincana Grande, the largest of these tunnels, has been sealed off by the Peruvian government for decades due to the high number of disappearances. Stories persist of explorers venturing into the dark, labyrinthine depths and never returning, or emerging days later under the altar of the Santo Domingo Church, delirious and clutching ears of solid gold corn. These tunnels suggest that the megalithic walls were merely the surface manifestation of a much larger subterranean complex, a world below, or Ukupacha, designed to facilitate the movement of priests and initiates in complete secrecy. The precision of the tunnel boring is just as baffling as the wall construction. The walls of the tunnels are often smooth and polished, lacking the rough pick marks one would expect from manual labour. This leads us back to the question of tooling. If the stone softening theory is dismissed, we are left with the abrasive theory, using harder stones, hammerstones, and wet sand to grind the limestone into shape. While this works for small statues, applying it to the interface between a 100-ton block and a 150-ton block requires a logistical miracle. To grind two such stones to a perfect fit would require lifting and dropping the upper stone thousands of times to check the contact points, a feat that would pulverize the stone and exhaust the workforce. The tired stone, or piedra cansada, offers a grim testament to the difficulty of this transport. Located a few kilometers from the main site, this massive monolith sits abandoned in a ravine. According to the chroniclers, the stone was being dragged by 20,000 men when the ropes snapped or the coordination failed. The massive boulder rolled uncontrolled down the slope, crushing hundreds, perhaps thousands, of workers in a bloody catastrophe. The stone was left where it fell, a weeping monument to the limits of human muscle. This incident highlights a critical discrepancy. If the Incas struggled and failed to move this single stone during the height of their empire, how did the builders of the main walls successfully move thousands of them, many of which are larger than the tired stone? This incongruity fuels the theory that the Incas did not build the megalithic sections of Sacsayhuaman, but inherited them. Proponents of this view point to the clear difference in construction styles visible at the site. The massive, irregular polygon walls form the base, while the upper structures are built from smaller, uniform rectangular blocks, the classic Imperial Inca style seen at Machu Picchu and Pisac. The transition is abrupt and jarring, suggesting that the Incas built their temples atop the ruins of a much older, more technologically advanced civilization, possibly the Quilchi culture, or an even more ancient unknown precursor. This Hanpacha, world above, culture worked with a scale and precision that the Incas revered but could not replicate, leading them to construct their own additions with the best technology they had, which, while impressive, paled in comparison to the titanic foundations. The Spanish chroniclers themselves noted this, recording that the Incas claimed the fortress was built by giants, or was there before the sun shone. This cultural amnesia is typical of post-cataclysmic societies, where the achievements of the ancestors become the mythology of the descendants. Furthermore, closer inspection of the stone faces reveals vitrification, patches of the rock that have been fused into a glass-like substance. This glazing is often found at the joints and on the outer surfaces. While geologists attribute this to friction polishing or the natural dissolution of limestone under pressure, it bears a striking resemblance to the heat-induced vitrification found in ancient Scottish forts. Could this be evidence of the high temperatures required for the stone softening process, or perhaps a byproduct of a lost technology that used focused solar energy or acoustic resonance? The acoustic properties of the site are undeniable. In the section known as the Rodadero, or the Sliding Rock, a natural geological formation of diorite that has been polished to a mirror finish, seemingly by glacial action but utilized by the ancients as a slide, there are carved seats and niches. One specific niche, often called the Inca's throne, possesses distinct acoustic qualities. If one speaks in a normal voice from this seat, the sound is projected clearly across the vast esplanade to the walls hundreds of meters away. Conversely, the shape of the zigzag walls acts as a sound baffle, absorbing or reflecting noise in specific patterns. It is conceivable that the site was designed as a massive acoustic instrument, used to amplify the voice of the ruler or to create resonance effects during rituals that would induce altered states of consciousness in the masses gathered below. The sensory experience of Sacsayhuaman would have been overwhelming. The visual dominance of the stone teeth, the auditory amplification of the chants, and the physical exhaustion of the high-altitude air. This supports the idea of the site as a psychotechnology engine, designed to solidify the social hierarchy through awe. The destruction of the site by the Spanish was not merely a scavenging for building materials, it was a targeted erasure of this power. By dismantling the towers and the upper walls, the conquistadors sought to decapitate the Puma, to break the spiritual connection between the Inca and the landscape. They utilized the smaller, manageable stones to build the colonial mansions of Cusco, literally embedding the sacred geometry of the Inca into the foundations of the oppressor's city. Yet, the megaliths defeated them. The Spanish lacked the technology to dismantle the core walls. They could not lift the 300-ton blocks, nor could they break them efficiently. Thus, Sacsayhuaman survived through sheer stubborn mass. It is a ruin that refused to be ruined. In the modern era, the mystery has only deepened with the application of laser scanning and ground-penetrating radar. These technologies have revealed that the stones continue far deeper underground than previously thought, and that the complex water systems are more intricate than the surface drains suggest. The nubs, or protuberances found on many of the stones, are another point of contention. While often explained as handling bosses used to tie ropes for lifting, their placement is frequently illogical for hoisting. Some are at the bottom of the stones, others are too small to support the weight. Alternative theories suggest they are related to the construction method itself, perhaps injection points for the softening agent or remnants of the moulding process, like the sprue on a cast metal object. Some have even suggested they represent star maps or calendrical counters. The sheer diversity of the stone shapes, no two are alike, implies that mass production was not the goal. Instead, each stone was treated as an individual entity with a specific role in the structural integrity of the wall. This organic approach to architecture, mimicking the cellular structure of biological tissue, is what gives the wall its earthquake resilience. The energy of a tremor travels through the irregular joints and is dissipated by the friction of the interlocking faces, allowing the wall to flex without breaking. It is a level of biomimicry that modern engineering is only just beginning to appreciate. The contrast between the static, rigid grid of the Spanish colonial architecture and the fluid, dynamic unity of the Inca walls is a clash of philosophies. The European desire to impose order on nature versus the Andean desire to work within nature's chaotic flow. As we stand in the shadow of these grey giants, touching the cold, smooth limestone that has witnessed the rise and fall of empires, the silence of the stones is heavy with secrets. They are a Rorschach test for our own technological arrogance. We look at them and see ropes and pulleys because that is what we understand. But the stones themselves, with their vitrified skins and impossible angles, hint at a chapter of human history that has been lost, a time when the relationship between mind and matter was fundamentally different. The stone juggernauts of the Andes remain the guardians of this lost knowledge, waiting for us to remember how to speak their language, a language not of words but of weight, frequency, and the immutable will to endure. Travelling further south into the Bolivian Altiplano, near the shores of Lake Titicaca, we encounter a site that makes even Sacsayhuaman look primitive by comparison. Puma Punku, part of the larger Tiwanaku complex, presents a mystery not of size, but of machining. At an altitude of nearly 13,000 feet, where the air is thin and the landscape barren, lie the ruins of what might be the most technologically advanced ancient structure on the planet. Unlike the organic, polygonal shapes of the Inca walls, the stones at Puma Punku are defined by sharp right angles, smooth surfaces, and intricate geometric patterns that suggest a level of pre-planning and industrial fabrication completely at odds with the primitive tools attributed to the Tiwanaku culture. The most famous components of this site are the H-blocks. These are identical, H-shaped monoliths cut from andesite, an extremely hard volcanic rock that is difficult to work even with modern steel tools. The precision of these cuts is staggering. The inner corners of the H-blocks are not rounded as one would expect from pounding with stone hammers, but are sharp, 90-degree angles. The surfaces are polished to a glass-like smoothness. What is truly baffling is the modular nature of these blocks. They appear to be prefabricated units, designed to interlock in a repetitive line, possibly forming a wall or a specialized conduit. The uniformity suggests mass production, implying that the builders worked from a standardized blueprint where tolerances were measured in millimeters. Drill holes found in the andesite blocks further complicate the narrative. These holes are perfectly circular and run through the rock with consistent diameter, exhibiting the spiral grooves characteristic of high-speed rotary drilling. We must ask how a civilization that supposedly lacked the wheel and possessed only copper and soft bronze tools could drill through hard andesite with the speed and precision of a modern diamond drill. Experimental archaeologists have attempted to replicate these feats using sand, water, and copper tubes, and while they can achieve a hole eventually, the time and effort required are immense, and the resulting bore lacks the clean, uniform striations seen at Puma Punku. The destruction of Puma Punku is as mysterious as its construction. The site lies in absolute ruin, with 100-ton slabs tossed around like toy blocks. The chaotic scattering of the stones suggests a cataclysmic event, perhaps a massive earthquake or a tidal wave from Lake Titicaca, which may have once extended much closer to the site. This leads to the question of age. While conventional carbon dating places the site's height around 500 AD, some archaeoastronomers argue that the alignment of the complex points to a much older date, possibly extending back 15,000 years to a time before the last ice age ended. If true, Puma Punku would be the remnant of a lost epoch of human history, a technological high point that was wiped out by a global catastrophe, leaving only these scattered, precision-cut puzzles as evidence. The scrutiny of Puma Punku's stonework demands a descent into the microscopic, for it is in the minutiae, that the conventional narrative truly begins to unravel. When one runs a finger along the inner grooves of the andesite conduits, the sensation is not of rough-hewn rock but of a machined surface, comparable to a modern kitchen countertop or a polished tombstone. This tactile impossibility is compounded by the visual evidence of the internal corners. In standard masonry, creating a sharp internal corner in a hard material requires a tool that is harder than the workpiece and possesses a rigid cutting edge. A stone pounded against another stone naturally creates a rounded filler, a curve where the two surfaces meet, simply because the pounding tool itself has volume. Yet at Pumapunku, we find internal corners with a radius of nearly 0 sharp right angles that plunge deep into the rock. To achieve this with the copper or bronze chisels attributed to the Tiwanaku culture would be chemically impossible. The tool would deform long before the andesite yielded. This implies the use of a technology capable of precise material removal, perhaps a form of high-speed routing or ultrasonic vibrating tools, concepts that are absurdly anachronistic for the assigned time period but physically necessary to explain the artifacts. Furthermore, the modularity of the H-block suggests a profound understanding of standardization. In a pre-industrial society, every stone is typically cut to fit a specific neighbor, a technique known as polygonal masonry seen in Cusco. Here, however, the blocks appear to be interchangeable. This indicates a conceptual leap to mass production, where a part is manufactured to a strict tolerance so that it can be used anywhere in the assembly. This requires a standard unit of measurement, a complex system of quality control, and a blueprint that dictates the exact dimensions of every component before a single stone is quarried. The implications of this are staggering, suggesting a society that viewed architecture not as a sculpture of piling rocks, but as a system of assembly akin to modern prefabricated construction. The mystery deepens when we consider the method of joining these massive blocks. Scattered among the ruins are I-shaped and T-shaped indentations carved into the stone surfaces. These are keystones, designed to accept metal clamps that would lock the blocks together, providing immense structural integrity against seismic activity. While the use of metal clamps is known in other ancient cultures, such as Egypt and Greece, the metallurgy at Pumapunku is unique. Analysis of the few surviving clamps, most were looted centuries ago, reveals that they were not merely poured copper, which is soft and structurally weak, but complex alloys. Some scans suggest the presence of arsenic bronze and nickel bronze alloys. Creating arsenic bronze requires a sophisticated knowledge of smelting, high furnace temperatures, and the ability to handle toxic materials. Moreover, nickel is a difficult metal to smelt, requiring temperatures that push the limits of ancient open-pit firing. The presence of these alloys implies a metallurgical tradition that has completely vanished from the archaeological record, one capable of producing high-strength fasteners to secure 100-ton blocks of andesite. The transportation of these stones is another logistical nightmare that defies the primitive label. The red sandstone slabs, some weighing over 130 tons, were quarried nearly 10 kilometers away, while the harder andesite was brought from a quarry over 90 kilometers distant, across the waters of Lake Titicaca. The conventional explanation involves reed boats and log rollers. However, Pumapunku sits above the tree line. There are no massive trees in the Altiplano capable of serving as rollers for a 130-ton load. Importing timber from the Amazon basin would have been a monumental task in itself, tracking logs up the steep Andean slopes. Even if rollers were used, the sheer ground pressure of a 130-ton monolith would crush wooden logs into the dirt. The alternative, dragging the stones on wet clay, would require a workforce of thousands, perfectly coordinated in the thin, oxygen-deprived air of the high Andes. The physical exertion required at this altitude is debilitating. Sustaining a massive labour force for decades of construction would require an agricultural surplus that the barren landscape struggles to provide. This leads some researchers to propose the geopolymer theory, suggesting that the stones were not quarried and transported, but cast. According to this hypothesis, the ancient builders ground the andesite into a powder, mixed it with a chemical binder, and poured it into moulds, allowing them to create complex geometric shapes and sharp corners with ease. This would explain the lack of tool marks and the precision of the forms. While geological analysis generally shows the stones to be natural andesite, the debate continues, as distinguishing between a high-quality ancient concrete and natural rock can be incredibly difficult if the aggregate is sourced from the local bedrock. If they were cast, it implies a mastery of chemistry that rivals our own. If they were carved, it implies a mastery of mechanics we cannot replicate with their supposed tools. Both options necessitate a rewriting of history. The orientation of the structures also hints at a lost purpose. The entire complex is aligned with the cardinal points, but with a slight deviation that some archaeoastronomers, most notably Arthur Posnanski in the early 20th century, attributed to the shifting tilt of the Earth's axis over thousands of years. Posnanski argued that the alignment of the Kalasasaya temple, part of the Tiwanaku complex, aligned perfectly with the solstices not in 500 AD, but closer to 15,000 BC. This theory, while controversial and largely rejected by mainstream archaeology, aligns with the geological evidence of the site's destruction. The ruins of Pumapunku are shattered in a way that suggests a violent, sudden catastrophe, not slow decay. The stones are not just fallen, they are tossed. Massive slabs are snapped in half. The entire site is buried in layers of hardened mud, distinct from the surrounding soil, which contains the fossilized remains of marine life. This suggests that the site was hit by a massive wall of water, a seiche, or mega tsunami from Lake Titicaca, potentially caused by a tectonic upheaval or a meteorite impact. If Lake Titicaca was once much larger, as geological shorelines indicate, a sudden displacement of its water would have obliterated anything on the shore. Such a cataclysm could explain why the site appears unfinished, with blocks seemingly abandoned in mid-construction, and why the tools and the civilization itself vanished. The survivors, if any, would have been reduced to a primitive state, retaining only the myths of the giants who built the Great Walls in a single night. This mythological dimension cannot be ignored. The local Aymara people have long held that the site was not built by their ancestors, but by the gods in a time of darkness, before the sun was created. They speak of Viracocha, the creator god, who carved giants out of stone and then destroyed them with a flood when they displeased him. These myths echo the global deluge narratives found in cultures around the world, suggesting a collective memory of a real ecological disaster that wiped out a pre-Ice Age civilization. The Portal of the Sun, a famous monolithic gate found near Pumapunku, adds to this enigmatic narrative. Carved from a single block of andesite, it features a complex calendar system that does not align with the solar year as we know it, leading to speculation that it tracks a different celestial cycle, or a time when the Earth's orbit was different. The intricate carvings on the gate depicting winged figures and the staff god show a stylistic connection to other distant cultures, leading to diffusionist theories that the builders of Pumapunku were part of a global network. The magnetic anomalies of the site add a final, eerie layer to the mystery. Travellers and researchers have reported that compasses behave erratically when placed on certain stones at Pumapunku. Some of the andesite blocks appear to be magnetized while others are not. Whether this is a natural property of the volcanic rock caused by lightning strikes, or an intentional feature selected by the builders is unknown. However, the idea that the builders could detect and utilize magnetic properties adds to the impression of a technologically sophisticated worldview. Walking among the shattered H-blocks, one gets the distinct feeling of walking through the wreckage of a factory or a power plant rather than a temple. The shapes are functional, industrial, and devoid of the ornate decoration found in later Inca sites. They look like components of a machine that has been disassembled by the wrath of nature. The silence of Pumapunku is the silence of a cold case file that has been open for millennia. It stands as a stubborn anomaly, a place where the physical evidence, the drill holes, the sharp angles, the alloys, the mass, simply does not fit the timeline we have constructed. It forces us to confront the possibility that the graph of human progress is not a straight line rising from primitive to modern, but a jagged series of peaks and valleys, and that we may be standing in the ruins of a peak that was higher than we dare to admit. The sheer existence of these stones proves that someone at some time possessed the capability to mould the hardest rock on Earth into complex geometries with an ease that we would struggle to match today. Until we can explain how a copper chisel can cut a perfect right angle into andesite, Pumapunku will remain a testament to the impossible, a stone fingerprint of a ghost civilization that has left us the puzzle pieces but destroyed the box they came in. The wind that howls across the Altiplano carries the dust of this enigma, eroding the evidence a little more each year, urging us to solve the riddle before the stones are finally reclaimed by the earth that birthed them. The tragedy of Pumapunku is not just its destruction, but our inability to comprehend its creation. It is a mirror reflecting our own ignorance of the past, a heavy, stone-cold reminder that history is written by the survivors, and sometimes the survivors forget the titans who came before them. The complexity of the irrigation systems, the precision of the sewage conduits, and the sophisticated astronomical alignments all point to a society that had mastered its environment completely, only to be erased by it. This duality of mastery and fragility is the enduring lesson of the site. It serves as a memento mori for civilizations. No matter how straight your lines, how hard your stone, or how advanced your engineering, the Earth can shake it all apart in a single violent heartbeat, leaving only scattered blocks to confuse the future. We are left with the uncomfortable sensation that the primitive ancients were perhaps not primitive at all, but simply different, masters of a different kind of physics, a different kind of relationship with matter, one that allowed them to treat granite like styrofoam and build for an eternity that was cut short. The impossible geometry is only impossible because we have lost the theorem that solves it. Crossing the Atlantic to the cradle of civilization, we arrive in southeastern Turkey, where a discovery made in the mid-1990s has effectively shattered the timeline of human development. For decades, the standard model of history taught that the agricultural revolution was the spark that led to civilization. The theory went that humans first learned to farm and settle down, and only after securing a stable food source did they have the time and resources to develop religion, art, and monumental architecture. Göbekli Tepe proves that this sequence is backwards. Buried beneath an artificial hill are a series of circular stone enclosures featuring massive T-shaped limestone pillars, some weighing up to 50 tons. Radiocarbon dating of the organic material found within the fill of the structures places the construction of Göbekli Tepe at approximately 9600 BC. To put this in perspective, this is 7,000 years before the Great Pyramid of Giza and 6,000 years before Stonehenge. At this time, humans were supposed to be nomadic hunter-gatherers, living in small bands and incapable of the large-scale social organization required to quarry, transport, and erect megalithic pillars. Yet, here it stands. The existence of Göbekli Tepe suggests that the urge to worship, the desire for the sacred, was the driving force that brought people together. It was religion that necessitated the settlement, which in turn necessitated the invention of agriculture to feed the workforce. The temple came before the city. The artistry at Göbekli Tepe is equally sophisticated. The T-shaped pillars are not rough monoliths. They are smoothed and carved with high-relief sculptures of animals. Foxes, lions, scorpions, vultures, and spiders crawl across the stone surfaces. Some of the pillars feature arms and hands carved into the sides, with belts and loincloths, indicating that the T-shapes represent stylized human figures or anthropomorphic gods. The craftsmanship implies a long tradition of stoneworking that must have preceded the site, yet we have found no trial pieces, no clumsy early attempts. Göbekli Tepe appears in the archaeological record fully formed, a cathedral built by people who were supposedly just emerging from the Ice Age. Perhaps the most perplexing aspect of Göbekli Tepe is not how it was built, but how it ended. Around 8000 BC, after nearly 2,000 years of use, the site was not abandoned or destroyed by war. It was deliberately buried. The builders hauled thousands of tons of earth, rubble, and refuse up the hill and carefully packed it around the pillars, completely covering the enclosures. This act of intentional preservation is the only reason the site survives in such pristine condition today. Why would a culture spend decades building a massive temple complex only to expend equal effort erasing it from the landscape? Was it an act of protection against an encroaching enemy, a ritual closure of a sacred era, or a desperate attempt to hide their gods from a changing world? The deliberate burial suggests a profound shift in ideology, a moment where the old ways were sealed away in a time capsule that would not be opened for 10 millennia. The act of burying Göbekli Tepe was not merely a physical undertaking, but a psychological singularity, a moment where the collective consciousness of a people decided to curate their own history by silencing it. This enormous labour of backfilling required as much effort as the construction itself, implying that the concealment was as sacred as the creation. It suggests a fundamental shift in the relationship between the human and the divine, perhaps a transition from the animistic, shamanic world of the hunter-gatherer to the structured, controlled world of the agriculturalist. As the pillars were covered, the knowledge they held was not destroyed but incubated, leaving us to wonder if the burial was a funeral for the gods or a seed planted for a future harvest of understanding. This intentional obscurantism has forced archaeologists to look beyond the central site of Göbekli Tepe to understand the broader context of this Neolithic Renaissance. We now know that Göbekli Tepe was not an isolated cathedral in a desert of barbarism, but the epicenter of a sprawling sacred landscape. Recent excavations in the surrounding Şanlıurfa province have revealed a constellation of similar sites, collectively known as Tas Tepeler, or the Stone Hills. Among these, Karahan Tepe stands out as a formidable sister site, potentially even older than Göbekli Tepe itself. Here, the architecture takes on a different, perhaps more visceral character. While Göbekli Tepe is defined by its T-shaped pillars arranged in circles, Karahan Tepe features chambers carved directly into the bedrock, filled with phallic totems and strange serpentine channels. One chamber features a human head carved from the living rock, staring out from a wall as a parade of stone phalluses stands in attention before it. This imagery hints at initiation rituals, fertility cults, or a profound obsession with the generative forces of nature that goes far beyond simple animal worship. The existence of this network of sites implies a level of social complexity that is staggering. It suggests a shared regional culture with a unified iconography and a sophisticated logistical capability that spanned hundreds of miles. To feed the armies of stonemasons, sculptors and labourers required to build these complexes, the localised hunting of gazelle and aurochs would eventually prove insufficient. This brings us to the most revolutionary implication of the 0 point of history. The birth of agriculture was likely a response to religion, not the other way around. Genetic analysis of modern wheat strains points to the Karaka Dağ mountain range, located just 20 miles from Göbekli Tepe, as the place where einkorn wheat was first domesticated. It is highly probable that the need to provide bread and beer for the great feasts and rituals at the temples drove these early hunter-gatherers to experiment with cultivation. The fermenting vats found at the site suggest that alcohol played a central role in these gatherings, acting as a social lubricant or a sacramental intoxicant that solidified the bonds between different clans. Thus, the first farm was not built to feed a starving family, but to supply a sacred party. The cultural explosion in this region also marks the first time humanity began to see itself as distinct from the natural world. In the Paleolithic cave art of Lascaux or Altamira, humans are rarely depicted, and when they are stick figures, insignificant compared to the majesty of the bison or the horse. At Göbekli Tepe, the T-shaped pillars represent stylized humans, towering over the animals carved onto their sides. This dominance is made explicit in the iconography of the man versus beast motif found on some carvings, where headless human bodies are depicted alongside vultures. This suggests a shift toward an anthropocentric worldview, where humanity is the axis upon which the world turns. The vulture stone, or Pillar 43, is perhaps the most controversial and information-dense artifact found at the site. It features a vulture holding a circular object, a scorpion, and various other animals arranged in a specific pattern. Some researchers, utilising archaeoastronomy, have interpreted this pillar not as a simple depiction of wildlife, but as a star map. They argue that the animals correspond to constellations, and that the pillar records a specific date, roughly 10,150 BC, which coincides with the onset of the Younger Dryas cooling event. This theory posits that Göbekli Tepe serves as a memorial to a global cataclysm, possibly a comet impact that devastated the Northern Hemisphere and forced the survivors to band together and invent a new way of life. While this comet hypothesis is fiercely debated, the astronomical alignment of the site is undeniable. The central pillars of the enclosures are oriented toward the rising of specific stars, such as Sirius or the constellation Cygnus, or toward the solstices, indicating that these early people were tracking the precession of the equinoxes with a mathematical precision that would not be matched for thousands of years. The skull cult offers another grim dimension to the spirituality of the Stone Hills. Excavations have uncovered human skull fragments that show signs of post-mortem modification, carving, drilling, and defleshing. This suggests that the ancestors were not just remembered, but physically integrated into the ritual space. The skulls may have been hung from the pillars or displayed in niches, serving as conduits between the living and the dead. This practice of ancestor veneration aligns with the transition to a sedentary lifestyle. Once you bury your dead in a specific place, you're tied to that land. You're no longer a wanderer, you are a guardian of the bones. The psychological impact of this transition cannot be overstated. For hundreds of thousands of years, humans lived in an immediate return economy, where food was gathered and consumed within a day or two. Göbekli Tepe and the rise of agriculture introduced the delayed return economy, where labour is invested today for a reward that will not come for months. This required a fundamental rewiring of the human mind, necessitating trust, planning, and the ability to conceptualize a future that did not yet exist. The temples may have been the mechanism that enforced this new social contract, using the awe of the supernatural to compel cooperation in the mundane. The artwork also hints at a shared mythology that may have spread across the globe. The handbag motif, a carving of a square bucket with a semicircular handle, found at the top of Pillar 43, is eerily similar to iconography found in Olmec art in Mexico, Sumerian reliefs in Mesopotamia, and Maori carvings in New Zealand. While diffusionist theories suggesting a lost global civilization are often dismissed by mainstream archaeology, the recurrence of this specific symbol at the dawn of history in unconnected cultures remains an unexplained anomaly. It forces us to ask whether this symbol represents a specific tool, a seed bag, a cosmological concept, or a standard of weights and measures. As excavations continue, the layers of history at Göbekli Tepe reveal not a linear progression of skill, but a regression. The oldest circles, Enclosure D, are the largest and most sophisticated, with the best stonework. The later circles are smaller, rougher, and less technically proficient. This devolution suggests that the society that built the first temples was slowly losing its knowledge, its cohesion, or its resources over the centuries. The burial of the site might have been the final act of a culture that realized it could no longer sustain the grandeur of its ancestors and chose to preserve the sacred past rather than let it decay. Alternatively, the burial may represent a violent rejection of the hierarchy and control that the temples represented. As agriculture took hold, social stratification increased. A class of priests and elites likely emerged to manage the surplus and the rituals. The deliberate filling of the temples could have been a revolutionary act by the common people, a rejection of the gods and the toil they demanded, allowing humanity to move into a more decentralized Neolithic existence. The discovery of the Urfa man, a life-sized limestone statue found near Göbekli Tepe in the city of Şanlıurfa, adds a haunting face to this era. Dated to the same period, it is the oldest known naturalistic statue of a human. Standing nearly 2 meters tall, with eyes made of black obsidian, the figure clutches its genitals and stares forward with a blank, inscrutable expression. Unlike the abstract T-pillars, this is a portrait of an individual. Looking into those obsidian eyes, we're confronting the first generation of modern humans, people who had just stepped out of the garden of the wild and into the enclosure of civilization. They are the ones who made the bargain that defines our existence today. The trade of freedom for security, of the spear for the plough, of the open horizon for the temple wall. The 0 point of history is therefore not just a date on a timeline, it is the event horizon of the human soul, the moment we decided to separate ourselves from the chaos of nature and build a world of our own making, a project that began with stone pillars on a Turkish hilltop and continues in the steel skyscrapers of our modern cities. The silence of the buried temple is not empty. It is heavy with the echo of that original decision, a decision that we are still living out 10,000 years later as we continue to bury our past and build upon the rubble of our own making. The mystery of Göbekli Tepe ultimately challenges the hubris of the modern age, reminding us that we are not the inventors of complexity, but merely the inheritors of a forgotten legacy, unaware of the giants upon whose shoulders we stand, or the reasons why they chose to bury their greatest achievements in the dark earth. South of the Turkish capital, in the surreal landscape of Cappadocia, the mystery moves from the hilltops to the subterranean depths. Here lies Derinkuyu, an ancient underground city of staggering complexity. Discovered by accident in 1963, when a local man knocked down a wall in his basement to reveal a tunnel, Derinkuyu is an engineering marvel carved directly into the soft volcanic tuff rock. It is not merely a cave or a bunker, it is a fully functioning metropolis that extends 18 stories deep into the earth, capable of housing up to 20,000 people, along with their livestock and food supplies. The scale of Derinkuyu forces us to reconsider the sophistication of ancient mining and ventilation. The city relies on a massive central ventilation shaft that plunges nearly 200 feet down. reaching the water table to serve as both an air duct and a well. From this central lung, thousands of smaller shafts radiate outward, ensuring that fresh air circulates even to the deepest levels. The temperature remains a constant 55 degrees Fahrenheit year-round, creating a natural refrigerator for food storage. The city includes wine presses, oil presses, stables, chapels, and even a religious school with a barrel-vaulted ceiling. The logistics of removing the excavated rock alone are mind-boggling, yet there are no massive spoil heaps found on the surface nearby, leading to speculation that the debris was dispersed into the local stream beds to avoid detection. The primary function of Derinkuyu appears to have been defense. The tunnels are narrow and winding, designed to force invaders to move in single file. At strategic points, massive circular stone doors, weighing up to 1,000 pounds, could be rolled across the corridor from the inside, sealing off the lower levels. These doors have a hole in the centre, allowing defenders to spear enemies while remaining protected. The complexity of the defence system implies a persistent and terrifying threat. Who were the builders hiding from? While early Christians certainly used the city to escape Roman persecution and later Arab raids, the original construction may be much older. Some theories connect the city to the Phrygians or the Hittites, while others look to the Zoroastrian texts that speak of a great underground enclosure built to protect life from a devastating, fatal winter. The connection to a global cataclysm surfaces again here. Just as the builders of Göbekli Tepe buried their temple, the builders of Derinkuyu buried themselves. Was this a response to the same environmental crisis? The Younger Dryas impact theory, which suggests a comet fragment struck the Earth around 12,800 years ago, causing massive fires and a subsequent freeze, provides a chilling context for such a shelter. If the surface of the Earth became uninhabitable due to fire or ice, an underground city with its own water supply and air filtration would be the only way to survive. The existence of dozens of other underground cities in the region, some connected to Derinkuyu by miles-long tunnels, suggests a massive, coordinated effort to preserve humanity during a time of surface-level apocalypse. The psychological reality of life within Derinkuyu offers a vista as chilling as the engineering is impressive, for to inhabit the subterranean world is to accept a fundamental severance from the rhythms of the sun and the moon. The people of Derinkuyu did not merely survive, they adapted to a sensory deprivation that would drive modern humans to madness. The city was designed not just as a bunker, but as a psychological containment vessel. The layout reveals a distinct social stratification and a desperate attempt to maintain normalcy in the face of an external apocalypse. The upper levels, nearest to the surface, contain the stables and the wine presses, areas where the smell of animals and fermentation would be strongest, acting as a sensory buffer between the living quarters below and the dangers above. As one descends deeper, past the third and fourth levels, the architecture becomes more communal and ritualistic. The presence of a cruciform church on the lowest level, carved directly into the rock with a barrel-vaulted ceiling, suggests that faith was the psychological anchor that prevented the society from fracturing in the dark. This subterranean cathedral, capable of holding hundreds, implies that religious services were not occasional but central to the daily routine, perhaps replacing the sun as the regulator of time. Without the rising and setting of the sun, time in Derinkuyu would have dissolved into a continuous fluid present, marked only by the tolling of bells or the rhythmic changing of the guard at the rolling stone doors. The acoustic environment of the city would have been terrifyingly intimate. Sound travels efficiently through rock tunnels, meaning that privacy was non-existent. The coughing of a child on the 5th level might be heard on the 7th, creating a collective hive-mind existence where every joy and terror was shared instantly. This forced intimacy likely necessitated a rigid social code, a strict hierarchy to prevent conflict in such a confined, high-stress environment. The discovery of a temporary holding cell or dungeon suggests that law and order were brutally enforced, as expulsion from the city would have been a death sentence. The immense logistical challenge of lighting the city adds another layer to the mystery. There is no evidence of widespread soot staining on the ceilings of the living quarters, which argues against the extensive use of smoky pine torches. Instead, it is likely that the inhabitants utilised linseed oil lamps, which burn cleaner, or perhaps a more sophisticated method of light reflection, using polished metal mirrors to channel sunlight from the ventilation shafts into the upper chambers. However, the deepest levels would have been in perpetual twilight, illuminated only by the faint glow of oil wicks. This chronic lack of sunlight would have had severe physiological effects, specifically rickets and vitamin D deficiency. The existence of the city implies a stockpile of medicinal herbs or dietary supplements, perhaps dried mushrooms or fish brought from distant rivers, to counteract the physical degeneration of the population. The sheer volume of storage jars found in the depots indicates a sophisticated understanding of food preservation. Grain, protected from the humidity by the constant cool temperature of the tough rock, could last for years. The wine presses were not merely for celebration, but for caloric preservation and water purification. In a siege, mixing wine with the well water would kill bacteria, making the alcohol a critical survival tool. The connectivity of the Cappadocian underworld expands the scope of this mystery from a single city to a subterranean civilization. Derinkuyu is not an island. It is connected to the nearby underground city of Kemakli by a tunnel stretching nearly 5 miles. This tunnel, currently collapsed in places, implies a regional network where goods, information, and people could move beneath the surface without ever exposing themselves to the sky. If Derinkuyu and Kemakli are linked, it is highly probable that the other 30-plus underground cities discovered in the region, like Osconak, Mazikoi, and Tatlarin, are also nodes in a vast, sprawling web. This suggests a geopolitical strategy of immense scale. It was not a series of isolated villages hiding in holes, but a unified state that decided en masse to retreat from the surface. The fatal winter hypothesis of the Vendidad, the Zoroastrian text, gains credence here. The text describes the god Ahura Mazda warning Yima to build a vara, an enclosure to protect the seeds of life from a freezing winter that would destroy the world. The vara is described as having 3 levels, a water source, and artificial light. Derinkuyu fits this description with uncanny precision. If the Younger Dryas impact event occurred around 10900 BC, causing massive wildfires followed by a plunge in global temperatures and a spiked increase in UV radiation due to ozone depletion, the surface of Anatolia would have been a death zone. The skies would have been choked with ash, blocking the sun, while the ground froze. In this scenario, the soft, insulating volcanic rock of Cappadocia offered the only salvation. The geological properties of the tuff are unique. It is soft enough to carve with obsidian or copper tools when fresh, but it hardens upon exposure to air. This allowed the ancients to carve out a metropolis in a fraction of the time it would take to build one of stone masonry. The sophistication of the ventilation system is the technological smoking gun of the site. The primary shaft at Derinkuyu is not just a hole, it is a masterpiece of fluid dynamics. By sinking the shaft deep into the water table, the builders utilised the temperature differential between the water and the air to create a natural convective current. As the warm air from the thousands of bodies and cooking fires rose, it pulled cool, fresh air down from the surface, creating a constant passive air conditioning system that required no energy to operate. This design prevented the buildup of carbon dioxide and methane in the lower levels, which would have suffocated the inhabitants within days. Furthermore, the defence mechanisms indicate a threat that was intelligent and persistent. The rolling stone doors, shaped like massive millstones, could only be opened from the inside. The sheer weight of these doors, up to half a ton, meant that once they were rolled into place, the connection to the upper levels was severed physically and psychologically. The small holes in the centre of the doors served a dual purpose: observation and lethal force. A spear thrust through the hole could kill an attacker trying to roll the door back, while the defender remained invulnerable. The tunnels themselves act as a filter. They narrow and twist, forcing an invading army to break formation and proceed single file, negating their numerical advantage. The ceilings in the corridors are often low, forcing a standing man to stoop, compromising his ability to swing a sword or thrust a spear effectively. This suggests the defenders were fighting a physically larger or better equipped enemy, forcing them to fight on terms dictated by the architecture. The mystery deepens when we consider the disposal of the excavated material. To create a city of this volume, millions of cubic feet of rock had to be removed, yet there are no spoil heaps. The landscape of Cappadocia is defined by its fairy chimneys and eroded valleys, but nowhere do we see the massive mounds of rubble that should accompany such an excavation. This implies a deliberate effort to conceal the construction. The debris was likely pulverized and washed away in the local streams during the spring floods, or spread thinly over the agricultural fields to enrich the soil, blending the waste into the environment. This level of camouflage suggests that secrecy was as vital as the stone itself. The builders did not want their refuge to be found. This paranoia aligns with the theory of the Sea Peoples or other marauding Bronze Age collapse entities, but the sheer depth of the city argues for an environmental threat. An army can be waited out. A climate shift lasts for generations. Recent ground-penetrating radar surveys have hinted at anomalies that dwarf the known extent of Derinkuyu. There are indications of deeper levels, possibly reaching 20 or 25 stories down, where the air would be thinner and the isolation absolute. These lower levels might house the tombs of the builders or the archives of the civilization, the libraries of a lost era sealed away for a future that never came to retrieve them. The structural integrity of the complex is another marvel. Despite the region being seismically active, Derinkuyu has survived for millennia without collapsing. The columns and pillars are spaced perfectly to distribute the load of the rock above, demonstrating an empirical understanding of geology and physics that rivals modern mining engineering. The builders understood the tensile strength of the tuff and the specific gravity of the overburden. The connection to the Hittites provides a potential cultural context. The Hittites were master builders and iron workers who dominated Anatolia in the 2nd millennium BC. Their capital, Hattusa, features massive cyclopean walls and underground tunnels, paterns. It is possible that Derinkuyu began as a modest Hittite cellar complex and was expanded over centuries by subsequent cultures. The Phrygians, the Persians, and finally the Christians, each deepening the hive to escape their own specific apocalypses. However, the tool marks on the lowest levels are different from those on the upper levels, suggesting a different technology or a different people. The deepest tunnels are rougher, more primal, perhaps hewn by the first desperate survivors of the Ice Age, while the upper levels show the refined chisel work of the Iron Age. This stratification of history means Derinkuyu is a vertical timeline. To descend is to travel back in time. The religious significance of the underground cannot be overstated. In many ancient Near Eastern mythologies, the underworld was a place of danger, the realm of the dead. For the Cappadocians, it was the realm of life. This inversion of the natural order, living in the grave to survive, must have generated a unique theology. The school found on the 2nd level with its study rooms and barrel vault suggests that education and the transmission of knowledge were prioritized even in survival mode. They were not just keeping bodies alive, they were keeping a culture alive. The barrel vault itself is an architectural anomaly for a subterranean space, usually reserved for surface cathedrals. Its presence here implies a desire to bring the grandeur of the world above into the world below, a psychological coping mechanism to remind the students of the sky they could no longer see. Finally, the ultimate fate of the original builders remains unknown. Did they eventually emerge when the ice retreated or the invaders left? Or did they dwindle in the dark, victims of inbreeding and disease? The city was inhabited as recently as the 1920s by Cappadocian Greeks fleeing persecution, but they were merely squatters in a ruin built by giants. The genetic legacy of the original builders may still exist in the local population of central Anatolia, hiding in the DNA of the villagers who unknowingly walk above the empty streets of their ancestors. The labyrinth of Cappadocia serves as a stone testament to the resilience of the human species, a reminder that when the surface of our planet becomes hostile, we have the capacity to return to the womb of the earth, carving our survival out of the darkness one room at a time. It stands as a dark mirror to our own potential future, a blueprint for survival should the skies turn against us once more. Leaving the earth and stone behind, we turn our gaze to the Mediterranean Sea, where a discovery was made that challenges our timeline of technological evolution. In 1901, sponge divers exploring a shipwreck off the coast of the Greek island of Antikythera recovered a corroded, calcified lump of bronze that looked like nothing more than a piece of scrap metal. It sat in a museum storage room for 2 years before it cracked open to reveal a series of precision-cut bronze gears. This object, now known as the Antikythera Mechanism, is widely considered the world's first analog computer, dating back to the 2nd or 1st century BC. The complexity of the Antikythera Mechanism is startling. It contains at least 30 meshing bronze gears housed inside a wooden case the size of a shoebox. On the front face, a dial displayed the Greek zodiac and the Egyptian calendar. On the back, 2 large spiral dials tracked the cycles of the moon and the timing of eclipses. By turning a hand crank, a user could calculate the position of the sun, moon, and 5 known planets for any given date in the past or future. The mechanism even accounted for the irregular orbit of the Moon, its acceleration and deceleration as it moves closer to and further from the Earth, using a revolutionary pin and slot gear system that would not be reinvented by European clockmakers for another 1500 years. The existence of such a device is akin to finding a jet engine in the tomb of King Tutankhamun. It represents a level of astronomical knowledge and mechanical engineering that was previously thought to be impossible for the ancient Greeks. The gear teeth are cut with equilateral triangular shapes, and the spacing is precise enough to perform complex mathematical division. The mechanism tracked the 4-year cycle of the Olympiad Games, the Saros cycle of eclipses, and the Metonic cycle of the Moon. It was a portable planetarium, a navigational tool, and a mathematical wonder. The tragedy of the Antikythera mechanism lies in its isolation. It is the only object of its kind ever found. While ancient texts by Cicero and others mention spheres of Archimedes that could model the heavens, no other physical evidence of this technology exists. The knowledge required to build such a device seemingly vanished with the fall of the Greco-Roman world. The technology of geared clockwork did not reappear in the West until the cathedral clocks of the Middle Ages, more than a millennium later. This gap raises a disturbing question about the fragility of human knowledge. How can a civilization reach the height of creating an analog computer, only to lose that capacity entirely? It serves as a potent reminder that progress is not always a straight line. It can be halted, reversed, and forgotten, leaving future generations to marvel at the impossible artifacts of their ancestors. Leaving the delicate clockwork of the Greeks behind, we travel east to the Bekaa Valley of Lebanon, where the enigma shifts from the complexity of the microscopic to the impossibility of the macroscopic. Here, beneath the ruins of the Roman Temple of Jupiter at Baalbek, lie the Trilithon stones, a triad of limestone blocks that dwarf every other megalith in the ancient world. Each of these 3 stones weighs approximately 800 tons, and they are raised 20 feet above the ground, sitting atop a foundation of smaller, yet still colossal blocks. The official historical narrative attributes the construction of the entire complex to the Romans, yet there is a glaring discrepancy in the engineering capabilities of the Roman Empire and the physical reality of the site. The Romans, for all their architectural prowess, typically built with bricks, concrete, and manageable stones lifted by cranes like the polyspaston, which had a maximum lifting capacity of roughly 60 tons. To move an 800-ton block requires a completely different magnitude of force. Even more baffling is the quarry located less than a mile away, where the stone of the pregnant woman remains attached to the bedrock. This monolith weighs an estimated 1,200 tons. Beside it, a recently discovered third block weighs nearly 1,605 tons. If the Romans had cut these stones, they would be the largest objects ever moved by human hands in history. Yet there is no record of this feat in Roman archives, which were meticulously kept. The sheer ground pressure of these stones would have pulverized the wooden rollers typically used for transport, and the slope from the quarry to the temple site is uphill, defying the laws of friction and gravity. The erosion patterns on the megalithic foundation stones are significantly heavier than on the Roman structures built atop them, suggesting that the Romans did not build the platform but discovered it, a legacy of a much older giant culture, and built their temple upon the ruins of a sacred site they could not comprehend but wished to claim. This pattern of later civilizations building upon the Cyclopean foundations of earlier ones is a recurring theme in alternative history, hinting at a global precursor civilization possessed of a lithic technology, based on the manipulation of mass and frequency, rather than the combustion and hydraulics of the modern age. Crossing the Mediterranean to Egypt, the mystery of lost technology moves from transport to fabrication. In the Petrie Museum of Egyptian Archaeology in London lies a simple granite core, known as Petrie's Core Tastra 7. Recovered by the famous Egyptologist Sir William Flinders Petrie, this cylinder of red granite is a waste product of a drilling operation. It shows a spiral groove running down its length, the signature of a tubular drill cutting into the rock. However, the spacing of the grooves reveals a feed rate, the speed at which the drill sinks into the stone, of approximately 1/10 of an inch per revolution. To achieve this feed rate in granite, which has a high quartz content and is incredibly hard, requires a pressure of nearly 2 tons on the drill bit. Modern diamond-tipped drills rotate at high speeds, but cut slowly to avoid overheating. The tool marks on the Egyptian core suggest a drill that punched through the granite with the ease of a hot knife through butter. Petrie himself, unable to explain the physics, suggested that the Egyptians must have used jewel points, set in bronze saws, but even diamonds would crush under the pressure required to create such deep grooves. The implications are staggering. Either the ancient Egyptians possessed powered machinery capable of exerting tons of downward force, or they utilised a technology we have yet to rediscover, such as sonic drilling, where the drill bit vibrates at an ultrasonic frequency to disintegrate the stone ahead of it. This theory of sonic machining finds further support in the thousands of stone vases discovered beneath the Step Pyramid at Saqqara. Over 40,000 vessels were found, carved from the hardest materials on Earth: diorite, basalt, and porphyry. Many of these vases have long, thin necks and bulbous bodies, with walls fully hollowed out to a uniform thickness, sometimes as thin as a playing card. To carve the interior of a spherical vase through a narrow neck requires a tool that can rotate and cut at an angle, yet no such tool has been found in the archaeological record. The perfection of the symmetry in these vases is absolute. When placed on a turntable, they show no wobble. Creating a single diorite vase of this quality by hand with stone rubbers and sand would take a lifetime of labour. Finding 40,000 of them suggests an industrial production line. The sheer quantity and quality imply that these were not the luxury items of a primitive culture, but the consumer goods of a technologically advanced society that could shape hard stone as easily as we shape plastic. Moving further east to the Indian subcontinent, we encounter the Kailasa Temple at Ellora, a structure that defies the very logic of construction. Unlike the pyramids or the Parthenon, which were built by adding stone to stone, the Kailasa Temple was created by subtraction. The builders started at the top of a volcanic basalt mountain and carved downward, removing an estimated 400,000 tons of rock to reveal the temple hidden within. The complex is twice the size of the Parthenon and features intricate bridges, rainwater harvesting systems, multi-story galleries, and ornate statues, all carved from the same single piece of bedrock. There are no joints, no mortar, and no room for error. If a sculptor severed a critical pillar or cracked a statue's face, the entire monolith would be ruined. There was no way to replace the rock. The conventional timeline states that this was achieved in just 18 years by the Rashtrakuta king Krishna Thuram in the 8th century AD. To remove 400,000 tons of basalt in 18 years, working 12-hour days, the workers would have had to quarry, crush and remove 5 tons of rock every single hour of every single day, without pause, not including the time required for the intricate artistic carving. The logistics of debris removal alone are insurmountable without heavy machinery. Furthermore, the top-down excavation requires the entire architectural plan to be visualized in 3 dimensions before the first chisel strikes the ground. The builders had to know exactly where the pillars, staircases and shrines would be located hundreds of feet below the surface. This suggests the use of advanced geodetic surveying and perhaps a method of rock excavation that goes beyond hammer and chisel. Local legends speak of an astra or celestial weapon that could vaporize rock, allowing the builders to melt the mountain away. While mythology is not history, the physical reality of the Kailasa Temple stands as a blatant contradiction to the primitive tools attributed to its creators. Far out in the Pacific Ocean, on the remote island of Pohnpei in Micronesia, lies the ruined city of Nan Madol, often called the Venice of the Pacific. This megalithic complex consists of nearly 100 artificial islets built on top of a coral reef, connected by a network of canals. The city is constructed from massive basalt columns, naturally formed hexagonal logs of volcanic rock that were stacked like Lincoln logs to create walls reaching 25 feet high. The total weight of the basalt moved to create Nan Madol is estimated at 750,000 metric tons. To put this in perspective, the indigenous Saudeleur dynasty, who are credited with the construction around 1200 AD, supposedly moved more stone than the builders of the Great Pyramid, but they did it on a remote island with a population of less than 25,000 people, using no pulleys, no levers, and no metal. The source of the basalt has been traced to a volcanic plug on the opposite side of the island, requiring the transport of stones weighing up to 50 tons through dense jungle and then over the water. The local oral tradition is explicit. The stones were not carried, they were flown. The legend says that twin sorcerers named Olisipa and Olosopa used magic to levitate the basalt logs from the quarry to the reef. While modern science dismisses levitation, the persistence of this anti-gravity motif across global cultures, from the mana of Easter Island to the sound levitation of Tibet and the golden wand of the Incas, suggests a misunderstood technology based on the manipulation of fields or frequencies. The site of Nan Madol also presents magnetic anomalies. Certain basalt logs in the structure are magnetized, affecting compasses, while adjacent logs are not. Did the builders select these stones for their magnetic properties? Was the city a machine, a power plant, or a transceiver utilizing the Earth's electromagnetic field? The sheer impracticality of building a massive stone city on a reef, far from fresh water and food sources, argues against a purely residential or defensive purpose. It was a technological installation of some kind, its function lost when the Sodler dynasty fell. These anomalies, scattered across the continents and oceans, form a pattern that is difficult to ignore. We see a legacy of precision, scale, and material mastery that often exceeds the capabilities of the cultures credited with their creation. The Great Pyramid of Giza is aligned true north, with an accuracy of 3/60ths of a degree, a precision that rivals the best modern observatories like Greenwich. The descending passage of the pyramid points directly to the star Alpha Draconis, as it appeared in 2070 BC. Yet the water erosion on the Sphinx suggests the Giza Plateau was developed thousands of years earlier, during a wet climatic period known as the Neolithic subpluvial. This chronological dissonance points to the inheritance theory, the idea that the pharaohs, the Incas, and the early Greeks did not build these wonders from scratch, but inherited the ruins of a much older, global civilization, which they repaired, repurposed, and claimed as their own. This ancestral civilization, often referred to as Atlantis Mu, or simply the mother culture, appears to have been destroyed in a cataclysmic event, likely the Younger Dryas impacts around 12,800 years ago. This catastrophe erased their cities, drowned their coastal centres, and scrambled their technology, leaving only the megalithic foundations and the impossible artifacts as durable witnesses. The survivors of this apocalypse would have been reduced to hunter-gatherers, carrying with them the fragmented myths of a golden age when men walked with gods and stones could fly. Over millennia, this knowledge faded into legend, until we, the children of the Reset, began to dig it up, mistaking the remnants of high technology for ritual magic. The fragility of our own civilization serves as a sobering mirror. If a solar flare or a nuclear war were to wipe out our power grid and digital archives today, what would remain in 10,000 years? Our steel would rust, our concrete would crumble, and our glass would shatter. The only things left standing would be the massive stone monuments, Mount Rushmore, the Hoover Dam, and the open-pit mines. Future archaeologists might look at the Hoover Dam and conclude it was a temple to a water god, built by a primitive people who worshipped concrete, completely missing the hydroelectric turbines that once powered a continent. The archaeological record is not a complete history. It is a survivor bias, preserving only the most durable materials. The impossible discoveries of the ancient world are not failures of science to explain the past. They are invitations to expand our definition of what is possible. They challenge the linear narrative of progress, suggesting that history is cyclical, a great wheel of rising and falling ages. We are not the first to scale the heights of engineering and astronomy, and unless we learn from the silence of these ruins, we may not be the last to fall. The mystery remains not in the stones themselves, but in our reluctance to accept that we might be a species with amnesia, wandering the wreckage of a forgotten home, trying to read the instructions left behind in a language we have forgotten how to speak. In the Bennecke Rare Book and Manuscript Library at Yale University sits a small, unassuming volume that has defeated the greatest codebreakers of the 20th century. The Voynich manuscript, named after the book dealer Wilfrid Voynich who purchased it in 1912, is a medieval codex written in an unknown script and an unknown language. Carbon dating places the vellum pages in the early 15th century, but the origin and meaning of the text remain a complete mystery. The book is illustrated with bizarre, colourful drawings of plants that do not exist on Earth, naked women bathing in green pools connected by intricate plumbing, and astrological charts that do not match any known zodiac. The text itself flows from left to right in short paragraphs, with no punctuation but clear structure. The words follow linguistic laws. They have prefixes, suffixes, and roots, and the distribution of characters follows Zipf's law, a statistical rule that governs natural languages. This suggests that the Voynich manuscript acts like a language, yet it is unlike any language ever recorded. During World War II, the top cryptographers of the US and British military, men who broke the Nazi Enigma code and the Japanese Purple Code, spent their spare time trying to crack the Voynich. They all failed. Theories abound regarding its content. Some believe it is a pharmacopoeia, a guide to medicinal plants, though the plants depicted are chimeras, roots of one species grafted onto the flowers of another. Others suggest it is a treatise on alchemy, or a heretical religious text hidden behind a cipher to avoid the Inquisition. A more skeptical view is that it is a hoax, a nonsensical book created by a clever fraudster to sell to a wealthy emperor like Rudolf II, who was known to collect occult curiosities. However, the complexity of the language argues against a simple gibberish hoax. Creating a fake script with such consistent internal statistical rules would have been an incredibly difficult task in the 1400s. Recent analysis using artificial intelligence has suggested the language may be a Creole or a cipher of Hebrew, written phonetically, but no translation has produced coherent sentences. The Voynich manuscript remains a locked door. It is a tangible piece of history that refuses to speak to us, a testament to the fact that even in our age of information and algorithmic decoding, there are still secrets that the past keeps hidden. It sits behind glass, its pages filled with alien flora and bathing nymphs, mocking our inability to comprehend the thoughts of the scribe who wrote it 600 years ago. To delve deeper into the enigma of the Voynich manuscript is to step into a labyrinth of provenance that is as tangled as the roots of its illustrated plants. The history of the book prior to its acquisition by Wilfrid Voynich in the Villa Mondragone is a narrative thread that connects some of the most eccentric and brilliant minds of the Renaissance. Inside the front cover, visible only under ultraviolet light, is the faded signature of Jacobus Sinipius, the personal physician to Rudolf the Cid, the Holy Roman Emperor who turned Prague into a capital of the occult arts. This signature confirms a long-held suspicion that the manuscript was indeed part of the Emperor's legendary Kunstkammer, a collection of curiosities that included everything from mechanical automata to supposed unicorn horns. A 17th century letter found tucked within the pages, written by the rector of Charles University in Prague, Johannes Marcus Marci, to the Jesuit polymath Athanasius Kircher, explicitly states that Rudolf purchased the book for 600 gold ducats, a fortune at the time, believing it to be the work of the 13th century English friar and empirical philosopher Roger Bacon. Bacon was a figure shrouded in myth, often associated with alchemy and magic, making him a convenient candidate for the authorship of such an inscrutable text. However, the carbon dating of the vellum to the early 1400s makes a Baconian origin impossible, as he had been dead for over a century before the animal skin used for the pages was even harvested. This discrepancy suggests that the attribution to Bacon was likely a sales tactic used by a clever courtier to inflate the manuscript's value to the gullible emperor, or perhaps a genuine misunderstanding by Renaissance scholars desperate to categorize the uncategorizable. The letter also mentions that the book had once belonged to the alchemist Georg Beresch, who, in a state of intellectual torment, referred to the manuscript as a sphinx that occupied his space uselessly, mocking his inability to solve its riddle. Beresch sent sample transcriptions to Kircher in Rome, hoping the Jesuit could decipher it, but even Kircher, who claimed to read hieroglyphs, remained silent. Upon Beresch's death, the manuscript passed to Marci, and then to the Jesuits, where it vanished into the archives for centuries until Voynich retrieved it. This confirmed chain of custody silences the theory that Wilfrid Voynich forged the document himself. The physical evidence of the vellum, the ink, and the historical trail proves it is a genuine artifact of the late Middle Ages, even if its content is nonsensical. The physical construction of the manuscript offers further clues that complicate the madman theory, which posits that a single schizophrenic author created the book in a state of glossolalia. Careful, graphological analysis has identified at least 2, possibly up to 5 distinct hands or scribes who worked on the text. These hands, designated as Courier A and Courier B, after the cryptographer Prescott Currier who identified them, show subtle but consistent differences in the shape of the glyphs and the slant of the writing. Furthermore, the statistical properties of the language, the Voynichese, shift slightly between these hands. This implies a collaborative effort, a scriptorium where multiple scribes were trained in this specific bizarre writing system. It is difficult to imagine a shared delusion or a coordinated hoax that maintains such rigid internal consistency across hundreds of pages and different writers. The lack of corrections is another baffling anomaly. In almost every medieval manuscript, one finds errors, scratched out letters, marginal notes correcting spelling, or ink blots. The Voynich manuscript, however, is written with a fluid, confident speed, with almost no hesitation or correction. The scribes knew exactly what they were writing, or they were copying from a source document that has since been lost. The flow of the text suggests a stream of consciousness or a transcription of speech, leading some to hypothesize that the text is a phonetic rendering of a spoken language that was never standardized in writing, perhaps a dialect of Proto-Romance, a creolized Asian language, or even a constructed language a priori, invented by a secret society. The illustrations, while offering no direct translation, provide a thematic map of the book's intended purpose, yet each section deepens the confusion. The botanical section, which constitutes the first half of the book, depicts plants that are meticulously drawn but botanically impossible. A flower might have the root system of a beet, the leaves of a fern and the bloom of a lily. These Frankenstein plants have led researchers to scour the globe for flora that matches, with some claiming similarities to plants found in the New World, such as sunflowers or armadillos, which would be anachronistic for a European manuscript from the early 1400s, unless one accepts the controversial theory of pre-Columbian contact. The balneological section is perhaps the most surreal. It features scores of nude women, often with swollen abdomens, bathing in interconnected tubs, pools, and chutes filled with green or blue liquid. The plumbing that connects these pools resembles organic structures, intestines, fallopian tubes, or veins, rather than medieval masonry. Some interpret this as a treatise on gynecology or hydrotherapy, while others see it as a metaphorical representation of the alchemical process, where the nymphs represent spirits or chemical substances undergoing distillation and purification. The lack of Christian iconography is striking. In an era dominated by the Church, the manuscript is entirely secular, devoid of crosses, saints, or biblical scenes, suggesting a pagan, hermetic, or scientific origin that existed outside the orthodox religious framework. The cosmological section features fold-out pages with complex circular diagrams. The most famous of these, the Rosettes fold-out, depicts 9 distinct islands or fortresses connected by causeways, with a central castle that features walls with swallowtail merlins. This specific architectural detail is characteristic of northern Italian castles from the Ghibelline faction during the 15th century, providing one of the few tenuous links to a geographic location. If the manuscript originated in northern Italy, as the architecture and some stylistic elements suggest, it could be a product of the humanist explosion, a time when scholars were rediscovering ancient texts and inventing new ciphers to protect intellectual property. The pharmaceutical section follows, depicting jars and vessels typical of a medieval apothecary, alongside roots and leaves. This strengthens the theory that the book is a medical manual, perhaps a book of secrets, meant to be passed down within a guild of healers who wanted to keep their recipes exclusive. Yet without the key to the text, the recipes are useless. The text itself, the Voynichese, is the ultimate fortress. The characters are distinct, with gallows letters that loop high above the line, and loop characters that resemble cursive E or O. The entropy of the text is unusually low, it is highly repetitive. A word may appear 3 times in a row, or differ from the next word by only 1 character. This echo effect is not found in most natural languages, but is characteristic of chants, mantras, or certain types of cipher systems like a verbose cipher, where a single letter of plaintext is represented by a variable length group of ciphertext characters. Computer analysis has shown that the text has a structure more similar to East Asian languages like Mandarin or Vietnamese, which rely on tonality, than to Indo-European languages. This has fueled the missionary theory, which suggests the book was written by a European missionary in Asia who attempted to transcribe a tonal language using a modified Latin alphabet, or conversely an Asian scholar brought to Europe who wrote in their native tongue using Western materials. Another compelling, though controversial, theory is that the manuscript demonstrates the use of a Cardan grill, a decryption tool invented in the 16th century to generate nonsense text that looks linguistically valid. A researcher named Gordon Rugg demonstrated that by moving a grill over a table of prefixes, roots and suffixes, one could generate text that follows Zipf's law, but has no meaning. If this is true, the Voynich manuscript is not a book of knowledge, but a book of nothing, a meaning machine designed to reflect the projections of the reader. It would be the ultimate intellectual trap, a centuries-old prank that has ensnared everyone from the Holy Roman Emperor to the NSA, yet the Cardan grill was invented a century after the vellum was made, requiring the hoaxer to be historically precocious or to use a precursor method. The Enigma is further complicated by the micrography theory, which posits that the individual brushstrokes of the characters contain tiny, microscopic shorthand notes that tell the true story, a theory that requires high-resolution imaging to verify and remains on the fringe. Every generation brings a new tool to the Voynich. In the 1920s it was frequency analysis, in the 1970s it was mainframe computing, in the 2020s it is deep learning and neural networks. AI models trained on hundreds of languages have attempted to translate the text, occasionally producing sentences that resemble Hebrew or Proto-Romance, but the results are always disjointed and require heavy cherry-picking to make sense. The AI, like the human mind, seeks patterns in noise. It finds words because it is trained to find words, but it cannot verify if those words were intended by the author. The manuscript acts as a mirror. Botanists see plants, linguists see language, historians see culture, and cryptographers see code. It is a Rorschach test bound in vellum. The tragedy of the Voynich manuscript is that it may be the last survivor of a lost culture, or a private language spoken by only a few people. If the key was held in the mind of the author and never written down, or if the cipher is actually a constructed language with no external reference, it may be mathematically impossible to solve. It sits in the library not just as a puzzle, but as a reminder of the fragility of knowledge. It represents the known unknown. We can hold it, weigh it, and analyze its chemistry, yet its soul remains completely inaccessible, until a Rosetta Stone for Voynichese is found. Perhaps a scrap of paper in a dusty European archive where someone wrote, "This symbol equals A," the book will remain silent. It is a monument to the things we have forgotten, a ghost story written in ink that refuses to be exorcised by the light of modern science. The women in the green pools continue their eternal bath. The impossible flowers bloom in perpetuity, and the stars on the fold-out pages spin in a sky that no astronomer recognizes, keeping their secrets safe from a world that demands to know everything. The Voynich manuscript is the ultimate anomaly, a physical object that exists outside of our understanding of history, language, and logic, enduring as the most difficult book in the world to read, and perhaps the only book that was never meant to be read at all. In 1929, historians working in the Topkapi Palace in Istanbul discovered a fragment of a gazelle skin map that would spark decades of debate about the history of exploration. The Piri Reis map, compiled in 1513 by the Ottoman admiral and cartographer Piri Reis, depicts the coasts of Europe, North Africa, and the Brazil with reasonable accuracy. However, as one's eye travels south along the South American coast, the map shows a landmass connecting to the bottom of the continent and curving eastward. Many researchers have identified this landmass as the coast of Queen Maud Land in Antarctica. The problem with this identification is twofold. First, Antarctica was not officially discovered until 1820, more than 300 years after Piri Reis drew his map. Second, and more critically, the coastline depicted on the map appears to show the land without its ice cap. The map details bays, islands, and river mouths in a region that has been covered by mile-thick ice for at least 6,000 years. Piri Reis noted in the margins that he compiled his work from 20 older source maps, some dating back to the time of Alexander the Great. This implies that someone, thousands of years ago, mapped the coast of Antarctica before it was frozen over, and that this knowledge was passed down through the Library of Alexandria to the Ottomans. The implications are staggering. For the coast of Antarctica to be mapped ice-free, the original surveyors would have to have been present around 4000 BC or earlier. This aligns with the Hapgood Hypothesis, proposed by Professor Charles Hapgood in the 1960s, which suggests that the Earth's crust can slip over the mantle, causing rapid climatic shifts that could have flash-frozen the continent. While geologists vehemently reject the crustal displacement theory, the map remains an awkward artifact. The accuracy of the longitudes is also puzzling, as the calculation of longitude requires a precise chronometer, a technology not invented until the 18th century. Another map, the Orontius Phineus map of 1531, also depicts Antarctica with mountains and rivers free of ice. These cartographic anomalies suggest a lost maritime tradition, a civilization of seafaring explorers who mapped the globe with sophisticated instruments long before the Age of Discovery. They hint at a pre-Ice Age world where the oceans were highways for a culture whose name we have forgotten, leaving only distorted echoes in the archives of later empires. The mystery deepens when we consider the Felipe Boache map of 1737, which presents a depiction of Antarctica that is even more baffling than the Orontius Phineus or Piri Reis charts. Published nearly a century before the official discovery of the southern continent, the Boache map shows Antarctica not as a single solid landmass, but as two distinct islands separated by a narrow waterway running through the centre. For 2 centuries, this was dismissed as a cartographic error or a flight of fancy, a geographer's attempt to fill the void of the southern oceans with a hypothetical Terra Australis. However, during the International Geophysical Year of 1958, scientists conducted extensive seismic surveys of Antarctica to determine the topography of the bedrock beneath the mile-thick ice sheet. The results were shocking. The surveys revealed that the continent is indeed divided into 2 major landmasses, East and West Antarctica, separated by a frozen trench that connects the Ross Sea to the Weddell Sea. If the ice cap were removed, Antarctica would appear exactly as Philippe Boache drew it in 1737. This correlation forces us to confront a logical paradox. How could an 18th century French geographer know the subglacial topography of a continent that had not yet been discovered, let alone surveyed with seismic equipment? The only plausible explanation, consistent with Piri Reis's own admission of using ancient source maps, is that Boache had access to charts dating back to a time before the ice fully accumulated, or perhaps during a warm interglacial period when the seaway was open. This pushes the timeline of the original mapping back even further, suggesting a maritime civilization that was navigating the polar regions at a time when conventional history places humanity in the Stone Age. The impossible accuracy of these maps extends to the calculation of longitude. In the history of navigation, latitude is relatively easy to determine by measuring the angle of the sun or the North Star above the horizon. Longitude, however, requires time. To know how far east or west you are, you must know the precise time at a reference point like Greenwich and compare it to the local time. A discrepancy of 1 minute of time results in an error of 15 miles at the equator. Until the invention of the precision chronometer by John Harrison, in the mid-18th century, European sailors could not calculate longitude accurately and often crashed into coastlines they thought were miles away. Yet, the Piri Reis map places the coast of South America in the correct longitudinal relationship to Africa. The accuracy of the relative longitudes is within a margin of error that would not be achievable by European navigators until the late 1700s. This implies that the source maps used by Piri Reis were drawn by a culture that possessed a method of calculating longitude that has been lost to history. This could have been a mechanical device similar to the Antikythera Mechanism, or perhaps an advanced method of a lunar distance calculation that we have yet to reconstruct. The mathematical projection of the maps offers another clue. In 1949, Captain Arlington H. Mallory, a cartographer and archaeologist, examined the Piri Reis map and noticed that the distortion of the coastline looked familiar. He hypothesized that the map was not drawn on a standard grid, but was an equidistant projection centered on Cairo or Alexandria. When Mallory projected the map onto a globe centered on Egypt, the distortions vanished, and the coastline of Antarctica aligned perfectly with the modern map of Queen Maud Land. This suggests that the original map makers were using spherical trigonometry and understood the curvature of the Earth with a precision that rivals modern satellite mapping. It points to Alexandria, the home of the Great Library, as the repository where these ancient source maps were kept before being dispersed or destroyed. The burning of the Library of Alexandria is often cited as the greatest tragedy in intellectual history, and the Piri Reis map serves as a tangible example of what was lost. If the library contained charts of the entire globe, compiled by a pre-Ice Age civilization, then our understanding of ancient history is fundamentally flawed. The existence of these maps supports the theory of a high-tech antiquity, where a global maritime culture, often referred to as the Sea Kings, mapped the planet during the late Pleistocene. This civilization would have had to thrive before the end of the last ice age, roughly 12,000 years ago, because that is the last time the sea levels were low enough and the ice caps retreated enough to match the geography depicted on the Portolands. The Zeno map of the North Atlantic, drawn in 1380, depicts Greenland without its ice cap, showing rivers and mountains that are now buried. The map also shows islands in the Atlantic that no longer exist, such as the legendary Freeland. While skeptics call these phantom islands, geologists point out that the rising sea levels at the end of the Ice Age would have submerged many large islands in the North Atlantic. If the Zeno map is based on ancient sources, it may be a record of the antediluvian geography of the ocean, preserving the memory of lands that were drowned by the meltwater pulse. The Haji Ahmed map of 1559 presents a similar anomaly for the Pacific Northwest. It depicts a land bridge connecting Siberia and Alaska, a geographical feature that has not existed for over 10,000 years. The mapmakers of the 16th century could not have known about the Bering Land Bridge, yet it is drawn with distinct clarity. This suggests that the source maps date back to the migration of humans into the Americas, preserving the geography of a lost world. The incredible detail of these maps implies an economic or military motivation. You do not map a coastline with river mouths and mountain ranges unless you are trading with it or settling it. The Piri Reis map shows animals in South America, identifying them with marginal notes, suggesting that the original explorers had landed and catalogued the fauna. The implications of a global trade network existing in 10,000 BC are revolutionary. It would explain the diffusion of cultural similarities across the oceans, the pyramids in Egypt and Mexico, the mummification practices in Peru and Egypt, the shared iconography of the handbag gods. If the oceans were highways rather than barriers, then human civilization did not develop in isolated pockets, but as a connected web. The maps of the impossible are effectively fossils of this lost web. They are copies of copies of copies, degrading with each transcription, like a game of telephone played over millennia. The medieval cartographers who drew them, Piri Reis, Orontius Phineus, Mercator, admitted they were compilers, not discoverers. They were tracing lines they did not understand, preserving the knowledge of the ancients, without knowing that they were drawing a map of the Ice Age. The Orontius Phineus map, for instance, shows the Ross Sea as an open bay, with estuaries and rivers flowing into it. Core samples taken from the bottom of the Ross Sea in 1949 by the Byrd Antarctic Expedition found layers of fine-grained sediment characteristic of river deltas. This type of sediment can only be deposited by flowing water carrying soil from an ice-free landmass. The dating of these sediments aligns with the warm period depicted on the map. This physical evidence corroborates the cartographic evidence. Someone saw those rivers flowing. The psychological resistance to accepting these maps is rooted in the paradigm of linear progress. We are taught that civilization began in Mesopotamia around 4000 BC and slowly advanced towards the present. The idea that a civilization existed prior to this, possessing the ability to map the globe and calculate longitude, disrupts the entire narrative. It suggests that history is cyclical, punctuated by catastrophes that wipe the slate clean. The Hapgood hypothesis of crustal displacement, while geologically controversial, was an attempt to explain the mechanism of such a catastrophe. Hapgood argued that the build-up of ice at the poles creates an imbalance in the Earth's rotation, eventually causing the crust to slip over the mantle, moving the poles to the equator and vice versa. This would cause flash freezing of tropical lands and the melting of polar ice, erasing any civilization caught in the shift. While plate tectonics has largely superseded this theory, the evidence of rapid climatic shifts, such as the Younger Dryas cooling, provides a mechanism for the destruction of the Sea Kings. If a comet impact or solar outburst destabilized the climate, the maritime civilization that mapped the world would have been destroyed by the very oceans they mastered. Their coastal cities would have been drowned by rising sea levels, leaving no trace but the maps preserved in the inland libraries of their colonies or trading partners, such as Egypt. The Portolands, a class of medieval navigational charts that appeared suddenly in the 13th century with no precursor, are often cited as the surviving remnants of this ancient tradition. Portolands are surprisingly accurate compared to the Mappa Mundi of the same era, which were symbolic and religiously oriented. The Portolands were practical tools, seemingly derived from a different source than the theological geography of the Church. Their grid lines, known as rhumb lines, radiate from centres that do not correspond to medieval cities, but to ancient hubs like Alexandria. The mathematical data encoded in these maps is effectively a time capsule, When Captain Mallory and later Charles Hapgood analysed the grid systems, they found that the maps had been corrected for the curvature of the Earth. This requires a knowledge of the Earth's circumference that Eratosthenes is credited with calculating in 240 BC, but the maps suggest a level of detail that implies centuries of data collection. The Piri-Reis map even corrects for the distortion of the perspective, suggesting an aerial view. This has led to the ancient astronaut theory, but a more grounded explanation is that the ancients possessed a method of geodetic triangulation that we have forgotten. They may have used the eclipses of the moons of Jupiter or other celestial mechanics to synchronize their clocks, or perhaps they had a high-tech solution, like the Antikythera Mechanism that allowed for the computation of longitude. The maps of the impossible force us to look at the blank spaces on our timeline and fill them with the possibility of a lost greatness. They tell us that the world was known before we discovered it. They whisper of a time when the ice of Antarctica was a green valley, when the Bering Strait was a bridge, and when the oceans were not a barrier of fear but a domain of mastery. They are the paper trail of a ghost civilization, proof that we're walking in the footsteps of giants whose names we have lost, but whose view of the world we're only just beginning to regain. The sheer existence of the Piri-Reis map in the Topkapi Palace is a defiance of the primitive label we apply to the past. It sits there, a gazelle skin stained with ink, mocking our arrogance, holding the coastline of a frozen continent in its lines, waiting for us to admit that the mapmaker knew more about the Earth in 1513 than we did in 1900. It is a puzzle that, once solved, solves the riddle of our origins, revealing that we are not the first global civilization, but merely the latest to redraw the lines of a world that has been mapped and remapped by the rising and falling tides of history. In 1936, near the ancient city of Ctesiphon in modern-day Iraq, a German archaeologist named Wilhelm König discovered a collection of odd clay jars that did not fit the typical classification of pottery. These vessels, about 5 inches tall, contained a copper cylinder, and inside the cylinder was an iron rod held in place by an asphalt stopper. König, observing the configuration of the metals and the insulation, made a startling deduction. These were not storage jars, they were galvanic cells, they were batteries, replicas of the Baghdad battery built by engineers, including experiments conducted by General Electric, have shown that when the jar is filled with an acidic electrolyte like vinegar, lemon juice or grape juice, it produces a voltage of about 1.1 to 2 volts. The chemistry is undeniable. The object functions as a battery. The dating of the artifacts places them in the Parthian or Sassanid periods, around 250 BC to 224 AD. This is nearly 2,000 years before Alessandro Volta invented the modern chemical battery in 1800. The question that haunts archaeologists is, what were they used for? There were no light bulbs or motors in ancient Baghdad. The most prevailing theory is that they were used for electroplating, transferring a thin layer of gold onto silver objects. This would explain the high quality of gilding found on jewellery from the region. Others suggest a medicinal use, as the mild electric shock could have been used to treat pain, a practice documented in Greek and Roman texts using electric torpedo fish. A more mystical interpretation is that they were used in religious rituals, hidden inside idols to give a magical shock to those who touched them, proving the power of the god. The Baghdad battery is a prime example of out-of-place artifacts. It represents a technology that was invented, used, and then completely forgotten. It challenges the linear view of technological progress, showing that electricity was not a discovery of the Enlightenment, but a force harnessed and then lost by the ancients. How many other technologies lie buried in the sands, discarded as ritual objects because we cannot conceive of their true function? In the 1930s, workers clearing the jungle for banana plantations in the Diqui Delta of Costa Rica stumbled upon a series of stone obstacles that would become one of the country's greatest mysteries. Scattered across the forest floor were hundreds of stone spheres, ranging in size from a few inches to over 8 feet in diameter and weighing up to 16 tons. What made these stones remarkable was not just their size, but their perfection. Many of them were nearly perfect spheres, smooth and geometrically precise. The stones are made of granodiorite, a hard igneous rock that does not naturally occur in the delta. The quarry sites were located miles away in the mountains. The indigenous people who created them, the Diqui culture, left no written records, so the purpose of the spheres is entirely a matter of speculation. They were often found in geometric alignments, triangles, straight lines, or curves, pointing to magnetic north. Some were found guarding the entrances to chieftains' houses, suggesting they were symbols of status or power. The mystery lies in the manufacturing. How did a people with no metal tools achieve such near-perfect sphericity on such a large scale? To create a perfect sphere from a hard rock require constant rotation and measurement. Any deviation becomes immediately obvious. The labour required to peck and grind these stones into shape with other stones would have been astronomical. Furthermore, many of the spheres were moved to their locations across rivers and swamps. Unfortunately, many of the spheres were destroyed by the banana companies. Workers, believing the local myths that the stones contained gold in their centres, drilled holes into them or blew them apart with dynamite, only to find solid rock. Today, only a fraction of the original spheres remain in their original context. They stand as silent sentinels in the jungle, a testament to a mathematical obsession and a mastery of stone that we still do not fully understand. They are planets of rock in a green universe, their orbits and meanings lost to time. On the island of Malta, buried beneath the streets of the town of Paola, lies the Hal Saflieni Hypogeum, a subterranean structure dating back to around 4000 BC. It is the only known prehistoric underground temple in the world. Carved into the limestone, the Hypogeum consists of 3 levels of halls, chambers and passages, mimicking the architecture of the megalithic temples found above ground. It was used as a sanctuary and a necropolis, containing the remains of over 7,000 individuals. While the architecture is impressive, the true mystery of the Hypogeum is acoustic. In the middle level, there is a niche known as the Oracle Chamber. A deep male voice speaking into this niche resonates throughout the entire complex, magnifying the sound 100-fold. Tests conducted by acoustic scientists have revealed that the chamber resonates at a specific frequency of 110 Hz. This is not a random occurrence. The walls appear to have been curved and shaped specifically to induce this frequency. The significance of 110 Hz is profound. Neurological studies have shown that when the human brain is exposed to sound at this frequency, the prefrontal cortex, the centre of language processing, deactivates, and the parts of the brain related to mood, empathy, and social behaviour activate. In essence, the sound induces a trance-like meditative state. The ancient builders of Malta seemingly understood the neurological effects of sound and built a temple designed to alter human consciousness through acoustics. This suggests a level of sophistication in the understanding of the human mind and the physics of sound that is far beyond what we attribute to Neolithic people. It implies that their rituals were not just superstitious ceremonies, but psychoacoustic technologies designed to facilitate a connection with the divine. Standing in the dark, echoing chambers of the Hypogeum, surrounded by the bones of the ancestors, the hum of the oracle chamber would have been a terrifying and transformative experience. A bridge to the underworld built of sound and stone. In the granite quarries of Aswan, Egypt, lies an object that offers a frozen snapshot of ancient engineering in action, and in failure. The unfinished obelisk is a titanic block of stone that was being carved directly out of the bedrock. Had it been completed, it would have stood 137 feet tall and weighed nearly 1,200 tons, making it the heaviest single piece of stone ever fashioned by the Egyptians, heavier than any block in the Great Pyramid. The obelisk was abandoned because a crack appeared in the granite during the carving process. It remains attached to the bedrock, offering a unique window into the methods of the quarrymen. The trench surrounding the obelisk is smooth and curved, with no marks of chisels or wedges. Instead, the surface looks like it was scooped out. The accepted archaeological explanation is that the workers used balls of dolerite, a rock harder than granite, to pound the stone away. Millions of blows day after day for years. However, engineers have calculated the time and effort required for this method and found it lacking. To pound out a trench of that depth with handheld stones would take decades of back-breaking labour in the scorching sun, with limited space for workers to move. The smoothness of the trench walls and the scoop marks have led some to speculate about lost technologies, perhaps large pendulum hammers, sonic drilling, or thermal shock techniques using fire and water to flake the stone. The sheer ambition of the project is what captivates the imagination. The Egyptians intended to lift this 1,200-ton needle, transport it to the Nile, load it onto a barge, float it downriver, and erect it vertically. The logistics of moving such a weight are terrifying. We struggle to move objects of this size today with our largest cranes. The unfinished obelisk is a monument to hubris, a stone that was too big even for the giants of antiquity, left sleeping in the rock, a dream of greatness that cracked under its own pressure. Returning to the desert coast of Peru, not far from the Nazca lines, we find a biological mystery that has sparked fierce debate. In 1928, the Peruvian archaeologist Julio Tello discovered a massive graveyard on the Paracas Peninsula containing hundreds of mummies. The skulls of these mummies were exceptionally elongated, some stretching back in a conical shape far beyond the norms of human anatomy. Cranial deformation was a known practice in many ancient cultures, achieved by binding the head of an infant with boards or cloth to shape the growing skull. However, the Paracas skulls present anomalies that are difficult to explain by binding alone. In typical cranial deformation, the shape of the skull changes, but the volume remains the same. The Paracas skulls, however, have a cranial capacity up to 25% larger than a modern human skull, and are 60% heavier. Furthermore, they lack the sagittal suture, the joint that runs along the top of the skull, which is a standard feature of human anatomy. These physical differences have led to wild speculation. Some researchers claim that DNA testing on the skulls has revealed genetic markers that do not match the local Native American population, but rather show links to the Caucasus region of Eurasia, suggesting a migration that history does not record. The most extreme theories propose that these individuals were a distinct subspecies of human, or even of extraterrestrial origin. While mainstream anthropologists maintain that the elongation is the result of binding, and the genetic results are contaminated or misinterpreted, the sheer physical strangeness of the